Astro Bot was my game of the year for 2025, something that was backed up by much of the industry at large as well. It's a delightful platformer full of creative ideas, cute visuals and an abundance of charm and joy. I rarely replay games these days, but Astro Bot was a major exception, and I have cleared that thing 2 or 3 times at this point. It is also, famously, full of references to a ton of other PlayStation games, and as I'm a bit of a nerd about PlayStation history, I really wanted to look into all of the games referenced. There have been other videos that have listed out the original games that these characters have come from, but that's not what this is. This short series of videos will provide some info on what each game is, dive into the development of each game, examine what the bot's name, description and animations are all referencing, and look into what each game's lasting legacy has been. Plus, each section will let you know if you can load up the game on your PS5 next to Astro Bot. With 195 VIP bots at the time of production, we have a lot to get through, and that's why this project is split into 4 videos, one for each PlayStation generation. Yes, the PS5 is in there, but since there's only 6 games representing it, I'll be grouping that system in with the PS4. Today, we'll be examining the PS1 going from 1994 to 2000. But first, a few points to note. These bots are listed in order of the original character's PlayStation debut, or in the case of franchises with multiple bots which I will group together, the PlayStation debut of the oldest character. This does mean that some franchises might show up in slightly odd places, but it should all make sense as we go along. Also, while I do have quite a bit of knowledge about most of these games, there are some that I do know less about, admittedly, and as such, it's very possible I've missed something or made some mistakes. If you have corrections, I welcome them, and I will add them to a pinned comment down below. But please, check the pinned comment for your correction before commenting, as I would rather not get 100 comments addressing the same thing. Thank you. Finally, before we begin, I would also love to draw your attention to a playlist I have linked in the description, where all the music tracks I use to represent each game have been placed in order. So if you hear something cool while we're discussing all of this, that's where you can go to hear more without me talking all over it. And with all that out the way, let's begin our journey in the best way possible. Please enjoy the iconic PS1 startup. Do you know what Sony Japan Studios' first full in-house project was? Good news, because I'm about to tell you. It was led by a man named Kazunori Yamauchi, a designer who joined Sony specifically to realise his dream of making the world's most realistic racing game, and wanted to use the internal team known as Polys to make it. Sony felt this was a bit too ambitious, so they asked him to tone it down and make a kart racer instead. That game was Toon Grand Prix. This was a racing game inspired by Western cartoons, where a bunch of wacky characters drove around in a bouncy, colourful world. Despite appearances though, this was not a simple Mario Kart clone, as Yamauchi was still determined to make his realistic driving game. This meant a lot of real-world handling was implemented. He would later describe it as similar to controlling an RC car, where they attempted to replicate suspension and corner handling. It made for an odd hybrid game that wasn't quite a casual racer, but absolutely was not a sim either. Toon Grand Prix has representation in Astro Bot via the malleable motorist. It's based on Captain Rock, a character who is front and centre on the game's box art. He was a pilot wearing a garish red coat and drove a similarly garish muscle car with a face, which can also be unlocked as his gacha item, the Squishy Speedster. Both the malleable and squishy descriptors refer to how the game liberally used squash and stretch techniques in its animation, as cars would constantly bounce around the world. The car's description also references this, specifically referring to how the cars would bend as you turned. Toon Grand Prix was not a huge success. Its confusing mix of realism and cartoony aesthetics was off-putting to reviewers, and sales failed to materialise, although a second game was developed. Only the second game managed to leave Japan. So, Why even reference this in Astro Bot at all? Surely this is some forgotten curio that means nothing. Well, all I'll say for now is that you should probably bear in mind the name Kazunori Yamauchi, what his ambitions were, and the team's name of Polys. Also, the description for the bot, which we haven't talked about. Surprisingly, we will be coming back to this later. Motor Toon Grand Prix is not available on the PS5. In the early 90s, fighting games were a big deal in the arcades, and of course, with advancements in 3D technology emerging, some developers wanted to use the tech to push the genre forward. Virtua Fighter is generally considered to be the first 3D fighter, and members of that development team would soon move to Namco, where they would develop an equivalent for them. That game was Tekken, a game that had a lot in common with Virtua Fighter, unsurprisingly, but its improvements caught the attention of a wider audience. What's more, it was built on Namco's System 11 board, an arcade motherboard that was based heavily on PlayStation hardware, making it easy to port over to Sony's fresh new console. And this would mark the beginning of a long relationship between the two companies. The original Tekken featured 8 playable characters, all of whom were skilled fighters entering a tournament held by the Mishima Zaibatsu, a conglomerate run by the scheming patriarch Heihachi Mishima. One of these competitors was Heihachi's son, Kazuya Mishima, out for revenge on his father for throwing him off a cliff as a child. Problem is, Kazuya happened to have the devil gene, which allowed him to survive the fall, and now Kazuya is a ruthless fighter looking to take over the world and rule it with an iron fist. Kazuya Mishima is the cold-blooded oppressor bot in Astro Bot. This is the exact title used in his reveal trailer for the latest game in the series, Tekken 8. He's named this due to his presence in later Tekken games as a cold, calculating figure who puts himself in positions of power to dominate others. This is most notable in the latest game, where he opens a tournament for fighters around the world, where the losers receive the prize of their home countries being destroyed. The bot's description mentions an iron fist, and while this is an accurate descriptor for a dictator, it's also a reference to Tekken itself. The name Tekken literally means iron fist, and it's also part of the name of the in-universe tournament, the King of Iron Fist Tournament. Kazuya's appearance as a bot is based on his original appearance from the first Tekken, although variants on this look have appeared throughout the series. His idle pose, where he punches his fists together and lightning sparks off them, appears to be based on an intro from Tekken 8 where he does this exact thing. I feel like it might be from an earlier game, but despite my best efforts I couldn't find it anywhere earlier. When the Kazuya bot is hit, he'll turn into a devil and fire a laser while floating in the air. This is a reference to Kazuya's devil form, which made its first canon appearance as the final boss of Tekken 2. He would even perform a move where he flew upwards and fired a laser. So, right as this video was finishing up production, Team Asobi added Kazuya's dad to the game. Thanks Team Asobi. Since I already mentioned his name, this is Heihachi Mishima, the patriarch of the Mishima family and head of the Mishima Zaibatsu Corporation. He is the one responsible for the King of Iron Fist Tournament, and was initially the final boss of the original Tekken. Since then, even if he is not the major villain in the game, he is still a major driving force for the events that happen. The feuding that defines his family is responsible for basically everything that happens in the series. He has appeared in every game in the series since the very first one. As a bot, he is the Iron Patriarch, another reference to the King of Iron Fist Tournament, and him being the Mishima family patriarch, as we've already stated. However, as his description states, he is a terrible father. This is because every negative event in the entire series can be traced back to the time he threw his son Kazuya off a cliff, which Kazuya retaliated with by throwing him off a cliff. So Heihachi threw him into a volcano, And then years later, Kazuya returned to the favour, killing Heihachi for good in Tekken 7.
Heihachi Mishima is completely dead.
Well, he was completely dead until Tekken 8 when he got better and was released as DLC. Speaking of being added to a game after launch, his appearance in Astro Bot is based on this appearance, with his karate gi hanging off one shoulder and wearing some new fancy beads. To further the point about him being a terrible father, as well as Kazuya, he also has an illegitimate Swedish anime protagonist son, a deranged daughter, an adopted son he abandoned who now makes robots to fight the Zaibatsu, a grandson who started World War III, and of course, his favourite child, Kuma, who is a bear he adopted. Conveniently, this bear is also Heihachi's gacha item, sporting a gi and bandana in line with his own appearance in Tekken 8. He has also been a playable character in every Tekken game, yes, really, although technically the Kuma in Tekken 1 and 2 is the father of the one who's been in since Tekken 3. His role in the series is Heihachi's bodyguard, because apparently the only effective bodyguard for a man who can headbutt a meteor out of the sky is a wild animal. Kuma is a loyal and faithful friend to Heihachi, who in turn has taught Kuma all he knows. This is how Kuma knows so many of Heihachi's moves, especially in Tekken 8. This is reflected in the duo's bot animations, where Heihachi tries to teach Kuma how to punch the ground. The move he is attempting to teach him is Battering Ram, a move that appeared in Tekken 7. This sees Heihachi slam his fist into the ground with such force it causes a minor earthquake, knocking his opponent slightly off balance. When hit, the Kuma bot will fart and cause Heihachi to slam his fist even harder into the ground, sparking electricity everywhere. Let's talk about that modified slam first. This is based on what the move became in Tekken 8. In this game, they introduced the heat mechanic, where characters became more powered up with a limited resource that you could activate once a round. Using this with Heihachi unlocked the Battering Ram move, which now sparked electricity and caused damage. It could also be chained from another move. Meanwhile, Kuma's fart is also a move in Tekken, appearing in his moveset from Tekken 3 all the way up to Tekken 7, where it was removed. This was a difficult move to perform, but it also destroyed the opponent's entire health bar. Kazuya and Heihachi representing Tekken makes a lot of sense. As well as these two being the driving force of the series' main plot, Tekken itself is a significant PlayStation franchise. As stated, the series was destined to have connections to PlayStation due to the original games being built on arcade hardware that used the PS1 specs. For years, the home versions of the series were PlayStation exclusives, all the way up to Tekken 6, which added Xbox to its platforms, and Tekken 7, which brought the series to PC. There is some flirting with Nintendo going on in there too, but nothing extensive. But even though the series is multi-platform now, the PlayStation versions do tend to get special treatment, with tournaments and a timed exclusive network test only given to the PS5 version of Tekken 8. It's also the version of choice used within most tournaments. Tekken is also generally considered to be one of the big three fighting games. It's unquestionably the most popular 3D fighting game out there for a start. Tekken is still a hugely popular series to this day, especially considering how much I've talked about Tekken 8, which released last year. The original Tekken is not available on PS5, however Tekken 2, the PSP version of Tekken 6, Tekken 7 and Tekken 8 are all available. In 1994, developer Exact made a first-person 3D mech shooter called Geograph Seal for the Sharp X68000. It was an early pioneer in full 3D visuals in gaming, and it caught the attention of Koji Tada, Sony's director of entertainment at the time. He approached Exact with a proposal to build on their work in a game for the upcoming PlayStation. Sony didn't want a mech shooter though. Instead, they wanted to turn it into a platformer, specifically so they could create their own mascot, similar to Mario and Sonic. The design ended up being a robotic rabbit, known appropriately as Robert. The engine was reworked to allow a range of movement in a 3D space, and special adjustments were made to camera movement. Eventually, the final game would appear on the console in early 1995 as Jumping Flash. The game was an early 3D platformer set on a series of small island levels with a ton of floating platforms. It's set in the orbit of Crater Planet, where a scientist named Baron Aloha has carved out various parts of the world and floated them into space to develop his own private resorts. Robert sets out to return these worlds back to the planet by retrieving the jet pods that power each island. The gameplay involved a lot of jumping around small environments to collect various items. Due to the nature of jumping in first person, the camera would always point downwards while in the air, allowing players to adjust where they were landing. Due to its presence in PlayStation history, Robert appears in Astro Bot as the Leaping Lapin. He remains largely unchanged from his original appearance. His name derives from the French word for rabbit, and the description calls him a pioneer of the 3D platformer genre. This is technically true, as the full 3D environments of Jumping Flash predate Super Mario 64 by a full year. On the crash site, he will mostly stand around, but if you hit him, he will leap across to another part of the plateau. This is a reference to how far his jumps could take him in his home game, and there's a similar animation to his launch animation at the end of a level. Jumping Flash did not ultimately provide Sony with a mascot, but it did provide them with a game that showed off the 3D capabilities of their system. It did receive a couple of follow-up games on the PS1, but the series has mainly remained dormant ever since. In recent years though, retrospective critical opinion appears to be growing positively for the game, with the game often being cited as an underrated gem in the PS1 catalogue. The original Jumping Flash is available to play on the PS5. After completing a mission for a publisher who would prefer not to be named in this video, developer G-Craft signed a deal with Sony to produce an RPG for their new console. That game would become Ark the Lad. In this, you played as a lad named Ark, surprisingly, who sets out to find his missing father. At the start of his journey, he reaches a shrine where a girl named Kukuru has accidentally freed a dark beast known as the Ark Ghoul from an ancient shrine. Ark agrees to reignite the sacred flame that contained it, but is struck down by the ghoul in the process. However, a mysterious spirit revives him and instructs him to find an item known as the Ark, which will save humanity. This tactical RPG attracted a lot of attention in Japan, and despite some interest in the West, Sony initially neglected to localize it. It would remain a mysterious curio outside Japan until the Ark the Lad collection was released through Working Designs in 2002. As one of Sony's earliest attempts to develop an RPG franchise, Ark himself is a bot in Astro Bot. He's the guardian of mankind who wields the lad's longsword. His description is both a reference to his quest to retrieve the Ark that will save humanity, and also the first Indiana Jones movie. However, unlike the Ark of Indiana Jones, the one in Ark the Lad contains all the goodness of humanity, which is the thing that will truly save us all. The sword's description could be a reference to the elemental guardians that Ark speaks to throughout the game, or it could be a reference to the spirits of the sequel, Twilight of the Spirits, where they were more explicitly called Great Spirits. Ark the Lad received an impressive 4 sequels, with 2 more games on PS1 and 2 games on PS2. Despite retaining the name, few of them featured Ark himself, but were all set in the same world where his actions had long-lasting effects. As stated, there wouldn't be a North American release until 2002's Ark the Lad collection and the 2 PS2 games, while Europe would only ever see Twilight of the Spirits. It's not one of Sony's more well-known RPG franchises as a result of this limited access outside Japan, but it is generally loved by those who did play it. While the original Ark the Lad games are not available on PS5, the PS2 sequel, Twilight of the Spirits, is available as part of PlayStation Plus. In 1993, Namco released a flight simulator to arcades as a way to show off their System 21 arcade boards. Known as Air Combat, this game saw players blasting their way through a series of enemy planes, trying not to get shot down themselves. It received praise for its technical achievements, including its state-of-the-art 3D graphics. With the release of the PlayStation, Namco wanted to bring a port of the game to Sony's console, and commissioned designer Masanori Kato and producer Kazumi Mizuno to develop it. However, it soon became clear that they couldn't simply do a port, so they came up with a new idea: create a new game with the same name and similar features and release that instead. And so, a separate Air Combat hit PlayStation in 1995. It was still an arcade flight sim, but it now featured more story elements and a flashy presentation built with the console in mind. It saw you playing as a pilot in a mercenary air force tasked with taking down the planes of a terrorist organisation that's attacking the fictional nation of Usia located in the world of Strange Reel. The game featured a ton of missions, each with unique objectives, and a range of planes that you could fly. It received critical and commercial acclaim, and Namco knew that they had to make more. Sequels followed, although the series would change its name with the second entry. Now called Ace Combat, the series released mainline games as exclusives for almost every PlayStation system. Ace Combat 6 skipped Sony and went to Xbox, but it returned to the PS4 for Ace Combat 7. Due to the historical exclusivity, Ace Combat is represented in Astro Bot with the aerial ace. This guy is based on Phoenix, the player character pilot from Air Combat. While he wasn't seen in that first game, his appearance is taken from the intro to the game's 3DS remake, and that appearance is itself based on the appearance of wingmen throughout the series. These were first introduced in Air Combat, where they were represented by helmets, but as the series has gone on, these wingmen have become fully fleshed out characters, including Kain, a character worth remembering for later in the video. Phoenix in Astro Bot can be seen steering a remote-controlled plane around, which is based on the EF-2000 Typhoon as seen in the original Air Combat. It's identified by its purple colouring and the insignia of Phoenix, the first game's player character. It also appeared on the game's box art. Ace Combat has been a successful series for much of its run, although it's less of a priority for Bandai Namco today than some of their other franchises. That said, the most recent entry did receive a lot of critical acclaim when it released in 2019. Anyone looking to play the series on PS5 will have to settle for just that latest game, as none of the others in the series have been re-released. After various business ventures in the 1980s, the Guillemot brothers soon found themselves selling CDs and computer software. This software business would become lucrative, and the brothers decided it would be wise to invest in video game development. In 1986 they founded Ubisoft, and soon after they would recruit a young designer with big dreams of using his love of animation to create a game. Michel Ancel had a character he wished to put into a game, and the Guillemot brothers were willing to fund his project. It was originally developed for the Atari ST computer before being moved over to the SNES CD-ROM before that was scrapped. So instead, they targeted the Atari Jaguar, and soon, another system of the day, the one that would emerge directly out of the failure of the SNES CD-ROM, the PlayStation. Michel Ancel's game Rayman would become a North American and European launch title for the system in 1995. Rayman was originally a 2D platformer which emphasised stunning visuals and animation, while also being surprisingly tricky. You play as Rayman, a limbless fellow who is sent to free the Electoons that help maintain the harmony of his valley. This requires him to find and break the cages containing them, before heading off against the evil Mr. Dark at the end of the game. The game was full of whimsical locations and strange concepts for a platformer, and it caught a lot of attention. Rayman continues to be a popular character with a strong PlayStation connection even to this day, so it's not surprising that he was eventually added to Astro Bot. He is the limbless legend, a reference to the fact that he has free-floating hands and feet with no limbs attaching them to his body. This is also referenced in his description, although it does mention he can pack a punch. Now this is a reference to his wind-up punch move, which was his main attack in his home game. Once granted to him by Batilla the Fairy, this punch made good use of his lack of limbs, as he could send it flying outwards a considerable distance. This punch can also be seen as part of his animations in the crash site. When hit, part of his animation shows him throwing one of these punches towards the floating ring he's swinging from. Which leads us nicely onto the Swing Ring Gacha item. This is a reference to a different power-up Rayman could obtain from Batilla, which gave Rayman's punches grappling hook functionality. If you saw one of these floating pink rings, punching it mid-air would lead him to swing around on it, which would be used in platforming challenges throughout the game. There's a third ability in here too. When hit, Rayman will perform another animation where he will use his hair as a helicopter to hover in the air. Yet another ability used in his original game for platforming segments and obtained from Batilla. Also, the initial animation when hit is similar, although not exact, to the animation when Rayman was hit in the original game. Rayman would go on to enjoy many sequels, with the second game moving him into 3D, where he would stay until 2011's Rayman Origins. This and its sequel, Legends, would take him back to his 2D roots with a greater emphasis on speedy platforming. Sadly, Ubisoft have been too busy with other franchises to do much with Rayman in the last 10 years. So we haven't seen much of him recently. I'm absolutely not counting that recently released NFT game they put him in. That's just a disgrace, quite frankly. The only Rayman game playable on PS5 is the PS4 release of Rayman Legends. Our next game begins life as a conversation in a Merseyside pub. Developers from the Liverpool-based studio Psygnosis wanted to make a futuristic racing game, one that appealed specifically to a young, club-going audience that was beginning to define the UK in the 1990s. With a roster of club musicians and a hip graphic design firm in Sheffield, the team spent 14 months developing their PlayStation debut, WipEout. This was a fast-paced hovercraft racer where sleek floating vehicles travelled at high speeds, flinging weapons at each other on tracks that banked and swooped through an eerie sci-fi landscape. Its bold visuals, coupled with a soundtrack that featured some of the UK's biggest names in electronic music, quickly became a hit and soon became a defining game for the PlayStation. It would soon be followed by 2 more sequels on the console, and Psygnosis would eventually be absorbed into Sony, becoming Studio Liverpool as they entered the new millennium. Naturally, there is WipEout representation in Astro Bot, with a selection of bots representing the various teams available across the series. However, it should be noted how little pilots feature in the WipEout series. Both the original game and WipEout Fusion did mention pilots, and there are backstories associated with them, but they don't tend to be featured in much promotional material, nor do they have much focus in the actual games. They're mostly just a menu option. And even then, the bots don't resemble any of those pilots. Instead, they all wear largely generic race suits in the colours of the respective teams. Those teams, however, do play a much larger role in the games, as they determine the ship appearance and handling. The 5 teams represented include the 4 teams from the original WipEout, Anti-Gravity Systems, Oricom Research Industries, Kyrex Research and Development, and Federal European Industrial Science and Research, or FISAR for short, along with Piranha Advancements, who were introduced as an unlockable team in the second game, WipEout 2097. Sorry, WipEout XL for the Americans, I guess. The AG Systems bot is the Anti-Grav Ace, whose description for both the bot and their associated craft reference the team's mottos from the mobile game WipEout Merge and WipEout 2097 respectively, a friend in speed, and the future is now. The name of the craft is the Rising Sun Racer, referring to the team's Japanese heritage. The Oricom bot is the Nova Stormer, which is a reference to the Psygnosis game Nova Storm, which first featured the team's name. The ship name, American Heavyweight, references the fact that Oricom ships tend to be on the heavier end, which improves their handling but caps their speed. Its description is also the team's tagline from WipEout Fusion. The Kyrex bot is named Speed Freak, and this, plus its description, are references to how these ships are usually incredibly fast, but handle poorly. Once again, the craft description is a team tagline from WipEout Merge again. The FISAR bot is named Future Racer, likely as a nod to how the team were the first to develop an anti-grav craft, and therefore kicked off the future of racing within the series. Its description references lore from WipEout Fusion, where FISAR's weapons development caused a significant disaster. The craft and its description are merely nods to the team's European origins. Finally, the Piranha bot is the prototype pilot, referencing the team's presence in WipEout 2097 as a prototype ship with maxed out stats but the inability to use weapons. This inability is also referenced in the bot's description. The craft's name references the team's nationality and association with actual piranhas. All the bots feature specific animations when hit, all of which reference the way ships can go out of control within the series. Otherwise, most of these are fairly generic racing animations with nothing specific beyond that. WipEout is in a weird place today. While Sony did drag it out of retirement for a mobile game that nobody played, the aforementioned Merge, the series has lain dormant since 2012 when Studio Liverpool were closed down. There is the WipEout Omega collection, but this is merely a reworking of WipEout HD from the PS3, plus tracks from its expansion, and the Vita game WipEout 2048. The series is still considered a beloved PlayStation classic, even if Sony seemingly disagree. In fact, the only WipEout game available to play on the PS5 is the Omega collection. Andy Davidson was a fan of the Amiga, a computer system that was popular in the late 80s and early 90s in the United Kingdom. Like many nerdy British boys of the time, he was interested in using these microcomputers to develop his own game. He began work on a war game called Artillery in 1990 using a Casio graphing calculator before moving the entire game over to the Amiga in 1993. Inspired by Lemmings, Davidson decided that the characters were going to be worms, and just like his inspiration, that would be the simple name for the final project. One chance meeting with Team 17's Martin Brown later, and Worms would release in 1995. However, while it did originally release for the Amiga, ports for other systems soon followed, including one for the PlayStation, which had recently released in the UK. Worms was a turn-based strategy game where players took control of a squadron of worm soldiers all trying to blow each other up. The game was somewhat chaotic as limited movement space and the presence of friendly fire added extra complexity in aiming your arsenal at your opponents. Weapons ranged from standard weapons and grenades to exploding sheep and airstrikes. While it could be played against the CPU, the game was best experienced with friends. Worms is represented in Astro Bot as one of the final bots introduced in the Christmas level. The wriggly warmonger is not based on any specific character, as Worms doesn't really have any. However, the size of him compared to the worms you can unlock as a gacha item strongly evokes the large general seen on the cover of Worms Armageddon, the third game in the series. The gacha worms more closely resemble those seen in the original game, especially with their prominent noses, an element that would be removed from the character design as the series progressed. Sadly, there aren't many specific references here. Many of the names and descriptions are references to them being worms and or soldiers. Even the hit animation where they wriggle into the ground to escape is generic and not specifically referencing anything. It's kind of disappointing, especially when they had a whole arsenal of weapons that could have been referenced. Somehow, Worms persists. There are no less than 21 games in the series since the original in 1995, with the most recent being released in 2016, although a remaster of Worms Armageddon was released in 2024. The publisher, Team 17, are still around and have mainly pivoted into indie publishing. This includes games such as Golf with Your Friends, which even features a course based on worms. That said, I wouldn't say it has a particularly strong association with PlayStation, as it's always been a multi-platform series, so I'm not entirely sure why it's here. Several Worms games are playable on PS5, including the original game, Armageddon, Battlegrounds, WMD, and World Party. One of the earliest Chinese novels known to history is Water Margin, also known as Outlaws of the Marsh and All Men Are Brothers. It featured 108 outlaws based on the exploits of Song Jiang, the 36 heavenly spirits, and the 72 earthly demons. These outlaws banded together to rebel against their repressive government. The novel is historically influential, with works across all media directly inspired by it, even to this day. While Water Margin is the English translation of the novel's title, it's known in Japan under the name, hang on.
Oh, you like Suikoden?
Ah yes, there we go. Suikoden. The protagonist of Suikoden was Tia McDowell, the son of an imperial general. After eagerly joining the military after his father and heading out on a few missions, he quickly realizes that the empire he fights for is corrupt, and the populace is unhappy. After coming into possession of the Rune of Life and Death, also known as the Soul Eater, Tyr flees and finds himself recruited into a rebel alliance whose goal is to bring down the corrupt empire. Suikoden was a notable JRPG for many reasons, including its 108 characters and 3 styles of battle. There was a standard turn-based battle system, similar to most JRPGs, a strategic war system, and a duel system which operated on a rock, paper, scissors idea. It was a game with a grand tale and the systems to match, and it won a ton of critical acclaim. Tyr is in Astro Bot as the first star. This name is a reference to the 108 stars of destiny that he ultimately gathers to fight the Empire, but as the leader, he's the first one. His description also references the vast number of playable characters in the original game. His gadget item is the bow staff, his weapon from his appearances in the first 2 Suikoden games. Once you've obtained this, Tyr can be seen doing a bunch of moves using this staff. These appear to be based on a combination of his basic attack in standard battles and his counter moves during duels. When you hit Tyr, a symbol will appear above him and he will summon a dark sphere around himself. This is a reference to one of the abilities granted to him by the Soul Eater rune. The symbol is the rune itself, and the sphere appears to be the Black Shadow ability which envelops enemies in a similar sphere. Suikoden received multiple games across the PS1 and PS2 up until Suikoden 5 in 2006. While the series has largely remained dormant, members of the original team went on to make a spiritual successor which released fairly recently, Eiyuden Chronicles: 100 Heroes. The first 2 Suikoden games are available on the PS5 via a remaster collection. Crystal Dynamics were a developer spun off from the 3DO company early in its history, but despite the split, they wanted to develop a game for the 3DO that would give the company a cool animal mascot, as was the style at the time. Initially proposed by the employee Lyle Hall as a stuntman named Gecko X, the original draft of their game would see this character venture through levels based on old movies. However, this concept was changed into a gecko who gets sucked into a TV and forced to battle his way through levels based on TV entertainment. His name was also shortened down to Gex. Also, with the steady failure of the 3DO, a PlayStation version was quickly brought into existence. Gex was originally a 2D platformer where the titular gecko ventured through levels based on TV channels, with different genres of entertainment such as horror and sci-fi. To make the game stand out from the crowd even more, Gex's couch potato persona was shaped further by comedian Dana Gould, who would provide the voice of the character and write all of his quips, most of which revolved around pop culture references.
This place is weirder than 4th of July at Rick James' place.
Hilarious, I'm sure you'll agree. Gex would go on to receive 2 sequels for the PS1 and later other systems, both of which were now 3D platformers. Curiously, these 2 games would also receive different regional variants, with the UK release of each game seeing Dana Gould's quips swapped out for more culturally British references delivered by veteran actor Leslie Phillips and Red Dwarf star Danny John Jules respectively.
Ding dong.
Gex makes a late appearance in Astro Bot as the square-eyed gecko. This is a reference to his addiction to television, which is seen in both intros for the original Gex and Gex 3D. This can also be seen in his behaviour in the crash site. His description refers to the fact that his games are built around literal channel hopping. Each level is based on a fictional TV channel, and he hops around because it's a platformer. Obviously. When hit, Gex will drop his popcorn similar to how his snacks are spilled everywhere when he's pulled into the media dimension in the first game. He will then hop on the floor and scurry around collecting this popcorn. This animation is actually similar to his climbing animation. Being a gecko, he has sticky fingers and toes, and this was used to climb walls across his games. The Astro Bot animation's similarity is best seen in Gex 3D, where the climbing animations are much clearer with the extra dimension. Gex did not last beyond the 3 PS1 games. They were heavily built around 90s pop culture references and failed to inspire much attention beyond the 3rd game. Crystal Dynamics would move on to other projects involving vampires and then take over from a beloved British franchise, both of which we'll talk about later. Meanwhile, one of Gex's original programmers would go on to become president of one of Sony's most prominent developers, who we will also see plenty of as this video goes on. A Gex Trilogy remaster has been announced for PS5, although it's not clear when this will release. The next game we're going to talk about has a history that precedes PlayStation. Capcom released Street Fighter in 1987 to mixed reactions. It was a clunky 2D karate fighting game where a martial artist battles his way through a series of opponents until he was victorious. History does not look kindly on this game, and Capcom don't seem particularly proud of it. However, there was potential, and Ryu and his rival Ken were brought back into a sequel that is quite possibly the greatest gulf in reception between two games in the same series. Street Fighter was a clunky, maligned arcade also-ran, while Street Fighter 2 was a game so good that it would go on to influence an entire genre, eschewing the linear narrative and instead offering players the ability to fight each other as a cast of 8 different characters, along with the introduction of combo mechanics and a flashy presentation. Street Fighter 2 became the blueprint for the entire fighting game genre as we know it today. We talked about Tekken earlier, but that would not exist if not for Capcom's 1991 classic. So of course, by the time of the PlayStation, Street Fighter was an established series whose home releases were big sellers for both Nintendo and Sega. However, after a few years of reiterations of Street Fighter 2, a new console generation and improved arcade hardware meant that it was time for an entirely new game. And so, Street Fighter Alpha was born, and it's with this game that the franchise made its PlayStation debut. Well, technically, it wasn't, as Street Fighter the movie The Game was a launch title for the PlayStation, but Capcom like to pretend it doesn't exist. Could it be that Capcom are embarrassed by it?
Of course!
Street Fighter Alpha, meanwhile, was a big hit. It was the follow-up to one of the biggest arcade games of all time, after all. It built on the fighting systems set up by the previous games, and introduced a ton of new characters to the series. Look, I don't need to explain what Street Fighter is to you. You know what a fighting game is, then you already know what Street Fighter is, because it's the template. Ryu and Ken both show up as bots in Astro Bot, taking on their appearances from Street Fighter Alpha. Ryu is the disciplined warrior, while Ken is the assured rival, which are names that reference their respective personalities. Ryu is a man who wants to become a master of his craft, training constantly and testing himself against the strongest opponents that he can find. Meanwhile, Ken is his friendly rival, a cocky American with a similar style. Ryu's description references a victory message that became an early meme and an urban legend due to a mistranslation. The original game stated that any of Ryu's opponents must defeat his Dragon Punch to succeed, a reference to his iconic Shoryuken uppercut. However, the English translation used Chinese words for the characters instead of Japanese, making players wonder where they could find a character named Sheng Long for an ultimate challenge. Ken's description is also a reference to a victory line from Street Fighter 2, although it's one that was actually translated correctly for its Western release. Hitting Ryu and Ken will cause them to perform a variety of moves from the series. Let's quickly go through them. Hitting Ryu causes him to do a Hadoken, his iconic projectile move where he tosses out an energy ball towards his opponent, which he has had since the original Street Fighter, and in every game ever since. He then holds up a fist and faces towards the camera, a reference to his Street Fighter 2 victory pose, which has also carried through into various other games. Ken will then use this opportunity to grab Ryu, who performs a counter throw, which is a reference to a special intro between the two in Street Fighter Alpha 3. Hitting Ken causes him to perform a Shoryuken, the iconic uppercut move we already mentioned, which has also been a series staple since the beginning. Ken will then brush his hair in celebration, a reference to a victory pose that appeared in Street Fighter Alpha. He will then perform a fist bump with Ryu, indicating their mutual respect for one another, which is an animation that appeared in Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. Street Fighter Alpha may have been the first PlayStation appearance of these iconic fighters, but it certainly wasn't the last. Since then, Street Fighter games have been staples of the PlayStation library, with Street Fighter V gaining exclusivity for a time. The series is still going strong today as one of the big three of fighting games along with Tekken and Mortal Kombat, and Street Fighter VI is a competitive favourite. Almost all of the Street Fighter games are playable on PS5. The various versions of Street Fighters 1 to 3, along with the Alpha Trilogy, are available in the Street Fighter 30th Anniversary Collection, and Ultra Street Fighter 4 received a PS4 port. Meanwhile, Street Fighter 5 and Street Fighter 6 are native to PS4 and PS5 respectively, so of course they're available too. With the arrival of the PlayStation, Capcom producer Tokuro Fujiwara wanted to push for a remake of his 1989 game Sweet Home, where the new technology would allow them to implement features that they were unable to before. However, upon realizing that Sweet Home was based on a movie license and they would need to renegotiate the rights, he had a new idea. Keep working with ideas from Sweet Home, but apply them to an original IP. Shinji Mikami was brought in to direct the project, which he originally envisioned as a first-person exploration project. Then he played Alone in the Dark and decided to shamelessly copy that game's fixed camera system. Ideas from Sweet Home were then bolted onto this, including a limited inventory system and an emphasis on puzzle solving across multiple rooms. That game would eventually release for the PS1 in 1996 under the name Biohazard in Japan, but is better known to us in the West as
Resident Evil.
The game takes place in a mansion where you have to move from room to room, finding keys to progress deeper in to discover its secrets. The first game offered 2 playable characters with their own scenarios that altered certain story events and changed the game's difficulty. These were Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, 2 operatives from the Special Tactics and Rescue Service, or STARS, of the Raccoon City Police Department. Both characters played similarly, with an emphasis on exploration and awkward gunplay with limited resources. The key differences were Chris having a smaller inventory and a lighter, while Jill came equipped with a lockpick. They were also accompanied by different characters which affected the story, with Rebecca Chambers showing up for Chris, while Jill partnered up with the greatest character of all time, Barry Burton.
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
Resident Evil also coined the term survival horror. The mansion is full of zombies and later other monsters, and while the STARS members are armed, ammo and health items are limited, forcing you to decide if you want to fight or run away from threats. The popularity of the game led to this gameplay design becoming the staple for the entire horror genre for years to come. This popularity also led to the game being strongly associated with the PlayStation in its early years, so it's unsurprising that both Chris and Jill are in Astro Bot. They are referred to as the Alpha Male and Alpha Female bots, named for the fact that they are both members of the STARS Alpha team, and not because Chris is capable of punching boulders and Jill knows her way around a railgun. The description for Chris states that he needs piano lessons, a reference to the first game's piano puzzle. A door can only be opened by playing Moonlight Sonata on the room's piano, which Jill can do easily, but Chris needs Rebecca's help as he can't read sheet music. In addition, his gadget item is the memory recorder, a typewriter with the description, "Hope you have an ink ribbon." Typewriters are save points in Resident Evil, although they are limited use, since each save uses up an ink ribbon item. As an additional reference, there is a diary next to the typewriter with the words "Itchy Tasty" scrawled on it, a reference to a famous diary entry found within the game, where a scientist slowly turned into a zombie. The description for Jill calls her the Master of Unlocking, a direct reference to this stellar bit of dialogue.
Jill, here's a lockpick. It might be handy if you, the Master of Unlocking, take it with you.
Her gadget item is the loading door, a reference to the loading screens in Resident Evil, which take the form of ominous door opening animations. That's not the only reference though, as 2 dogs are barking at the door in the crash site, a reference to both the fact that the Alpha team can't leave the front door of the mansion due to the presence of zombie dogs out there, and this sequence. Also, just next to the door you can see a green herb, a common healing item in the Resident Evil series, as a neat little additional reference. Oh, and then they went and added a third bot from Resident Evil 1. The suave traitor is Albert Wesker, a third STARS team member. And spoiler alert, as you may have guessed from his name, he is not a good guy. He is the member of your team who is revealed to be involved with the whole plot. He works for Umbrella, the company mentioned in his description, a biotech firm who manufactured the virus that caused all the horror. This virus is also Wesker's gacha item, specifically the T-virus of the first game. The dual identity he exhibits throughout the first game is on show in his bot form, as hitting him switches him from his stoic STARS operative to mad scientist. And yes, he keeps the sunglasses and hair while in mad scientist mode in the original game too. Of course, the popularity of the first game led to an inevitable sequel.
Resident Evil 2.
Released in 1998 and extended the scope from a mansion to the entirety of Raccoon City. We also got to play with two new characters, Leon Kennedy and Claire Redfield, and both of these are also in Astro Bot. Leon is the rookie cop whose description states that he is having the worst first day. This describes his role in Resident Evil 2 as a cop who has arrived in the city to start his first day on the job, only to find the city and the police station overrun by zombies. Claire is the motorcycle enthusiast, a reference to the fact that she's a biker. Her description references the fact that she is the sister to Chris Redfield and is in Raccoon City looking for him after the mansion incident caused him to lose contact with her. This may also reference the fact that many of her survival skills were taught to her by Chris, which is why she is just as capable as the trained police officers who make up the rest of the cast. Leon's gacha item is the statue and cop. The statue is one with slots for medallions to be placed. The closest I could find to this in the original Resident Evil 2 is a statue in the police station that can give you a key once you've placed a medallion in it. However, in the remake, there's another statue, and this one seems to be the more direct inspiration. This statue required 3 medallions in order to open the secret exit to the police station. The cop is one of the zombie cops that you encounter throughout the police station, or, more specifically, it could be Marvin Branner, an injured officer you find early on in both versions of the game, especially as Marvin is typically found right next to the medallion statue in the remake, although this is initially while he's still barely human. Claire's gacha item is the symbolic door, a door with a heart on it. This is a reference to the various card suit doors found in the game, which are opened with the key with the same symbol. In the crash site, Claire can be seen trying the spade, club and diamond keys on the heart door, oblivious to the correct key being behind her on the floor. Resident Evil continues to be a massive series and still carries a strong association with PlayStation even with releases elsewhere. New entries in the franchise are still being made, and many of the older games have seen remakes to bring them up to modern standards. It is, without a doubt, one of the biggest horror franchises out there, and also one of Capcom's best sellers. This is a series that shows no signs of stopping. And, good news, almost every single Resident Evil game is available on PS5. The only exceptions to this are the original PS1 versions of Resident Evil 2 and 3, although their remakes are available. The 1990s saw the rise of extreme sports in a big way, and naturally that found its way to the PlayStation early on. Japanese developer Uep Systems developed a snowboarding game for Sony in 1996 based on the popularity of the sport in Japan. That game was Cool Borders. Cool Borders was a fairly basic game by today's standards. It featured 3 courses of varying difficulty where the goal was to get to the bottom as fast as possible and earn as many trick points as you could. Other than that, it was fairly standard as you accelerated based on the slope of the mountain and had to navigate your way around obstacles and jump for cool air wherever possible. Cool Borders is represented in Astro Bot with the board member, a snowboarder whose gear has a description naming the series. It's not based on any specific character from the games, however. When hit, he'll jump and perform a grab, similar to the tricks you can perform when you launch off a ramp in Cool Borders. After performing this trick, the bot will land in a clumsy slide and gather enough snow to become a snowman. This might be a reference to the unlockable snowman character you can obtain by clearing all courses in the original game. Cool Borders would receive multiple sequels across the PS1 and PS2, although Uep Systems would face financial troubles and shut down, with American studio Idle Minds stepping into their shoes. Cool Borders helped open the door to the wider extreme sports genre on PlayStation, something that would lead to big things further down the line. More on that later. The series is largely forgotten these days, although Idle Minds are still around under the new name of Deck 9, and they're working on... Oh, sorry, I can't mention it because, once again, this publisher doesn't want to be mentioned, which is strange. You'd think they'd want the double exposure. The original Cool Borders is available on the PS5 via PlayStation Plus. Following the establishment of Universal Interactive Studios in the early 90s, the search was on for developers with interesting projects that the company could take on. The publisher acquired the rights to a Mortal Kombat clone developed by a fresh upstart team named Naughty Dog and agreed to publish any project they had in mind afterwards. Following the release of War of the Warrior for the 3DO, Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin, the founders of the studio, decided to work on a mascot platformer, one that they initially dubbed Sonic's Ass Game. After experimenting with different concepts, including time travel dinosaurs and a character named Willy the Wombat, they eventually settled on Crash Bandicoot. The game would be a partially 3D platformer, one that still had the linearity of side-scrollers, but could experiment with perspective and alternate routes with the extra dimension. The final game saw Crash travel across 3 islands, leaping his way past dangerous traps and enemies on his way to defeat Dr. Neo Cortex, the mad scientist who experimented on him and kidnapped his girlfriend Torna. Crash Bandicoot quickly became a big hit on its release in 1996. Due to the game's publishing deal between Universal and Sony, Crash was quickly considered to be a mascot for Sony, similar to Mario for Nintendo or Sonic for Sega. He would become a massive presence around the console, with 2 sequels and a kart racer co-published with Sony, all released for the PS1. It also gained success in Japan, where a special theme song and dance were developed for marketing purposes. And of course, Crash is a bot in Astro Bot, named the Spinning Marsupial. He can be found doing the exact dance that was developed for the Japanese market, a dance that Naughty Dog approved of so much that it would appear in future installments of the series. Astro will also do the dance if the down button is pressed on the D-pad next to Crash. The Crash bot can also be found with Aku Aku, the wise floating tiki mask that offers Crash sage advice, but also protects him from harm. Players will collect up to 3 Aku Aku masks in a level, with the first 2 offering an extra hit point for Crash, while the third offers a brief period of invincibility. If Astro hits Crash, he'll do a spin, which is the standard attack move across all his games. Oh, and when you find him in the Aztec Trail level, he's found behind a crate of Wumpa Fruit, the standard collectible that you can find throughout the games. After huge success during the PS1 era, things would soon change dramatically for Crash Bandicoot and Sony. Universal retained the rights to the character, and they would take the franchise to other developers from the PS2 era onwards. Universal Interactive would be purchased by Vivendi in 2000, Vivendi merged with Activision in 2008, and Activision were acquired by Microsoft in 2023, leaving Sony's original mascot in the hands of their greatest rival. Crash's legacy hasn't quite been as good as it was, although an attempted revival with 2020's Crash Bandicoot 4 was cut short by Activision management for not selling Call of Duty numbers, which is quite frankly madness. However, this breakup didn't leave Sony empty-handed. While they didn't have Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog were very interested in continuing their relationship. We will have more on that later in the video. The original version of Crash Bandicoot is not available for PS5, but the Insane trilogy, containing remakes of it and its 2 immediate sequels, did release for PS4. The remake of Crash Team Racing and 2020's PS4 sequel Crash Bandicoot 4 are also available. Silicon Knights had some decent success publishing dense strategy games for PCs, but they had ambitions of bringing the PC gaming experience to console as well. President Dennis Dyack had drafted a proposal for a game known as the Pillars of Nosgoth in 1993, which he envisioned as a vampire-themed RPG. Publisher Crystal Dynamics loved the idea and signed a deal for the game. They also provided assistance via one of their designers, Amy Hennig, and eventually the game would take shape as a PlayStation exclusive. That game was Blood Omen: Legacy of Kain. Blood Omen is a top-down action RPG where you play as Kain, a nobleman who is killed by assassins and offered a Faustian bargain by a necromancer. He becomes a vampire, cursed to feed on the blood of innocents, all while being wrapped up in the machinations of a cosmic game. It's a game that pushes the boundaries of games released in 1996, with impressive Shakespearean acting, and a dark, complex story where you may be the villain after all. Kain is also the Vamp Champ bot in Astro Bot. His description is a pun based on the name of the legacy of Kain's main world, Nosgoth. His gacha item is the Thirsty Cutlass, which is based on the Soul Reaver sword that plays a large role across the series. Once you've obtained it, Kain can be found lounging around drinking wine, a nod to the canon ending of Blood Omen, where Kain chooses to damn the world and rule in hell, drinking triumphantly from a goblet on his bone throne. When hit, Kain will briefly turn into bats, a reference to the bat form you can acquire in the same game. Following the release of Blood Omen, Crystal Dynamics wanted to develop a sequel. However, due to disputes between them and Silicon Knights, development was transferred to an internal team where Hennig would be promoted to director. This led to a protracted legal battle over the IP rights, although ultimately Crystal Dynamics would be successful and their sequel was able to go ahead. The sequel took the focus away from Kain, and instead the team were inspired to create a fallen vampire story based on Paradise Lost. The protagonist would be one of Kain's lieutenants, Raziel, who was disgraced and cast out after surpassing his master's evolution by growing wings before him. The punishment for his transgressions, as he was cast into the Well of Souls, burning for an eternity, and emerged as a wraith, a devourer of souls, a soul reaver, if you will, which conveniently was the name of the sequel, Legacy of Kain, Soul Reaver. The game moved from 2D to 3D as Raziel explored the vast world of Nosgoth in a Zelda-style adventure. It also featured the technically impressive mechanic of shifting, where Raziel could shift between the spectral realm and the realm of the living at the touch of a button. It also featured no visible loading times, another impressive technical feat for the PS1. This led to it quickly being considered one of the console's best games. Naturally, this led to Raziel also becoming a bot in Astro Bot. He's referred to as the Resurrected Wraith, which is a literal description of what happens to him in the Soul Reaver intro. Once unlocked, he can be found brooding in the crash site on a rock, a direct reference to official artwork for Soul Reaver. When hit, he causes the environment to shift to the spectral realm before shifting it back, just like the central mechanic of his home game. He even performs similar arm movements. Legacy of Kain would go on to receive 3 PS2 sequels, Soul Reaver 2, Blood Omen 2, and a game that brought Kain and Raziel's stories together as one, Defiance. Shortly after, Crystal Dynamics would take control of another action-adventure series, which we'll talk about in a second, and Amy Hennig would leave for Naughty Dog to work on yet another action-adventure series, which we'll talk about much later. Since then, things had been quiet for the series as Crystal Dynamics would become part of Eidos, who would go on to be bought by another publisher, who had no real interest in the series. It's not the only thing they have no interest in. However, enthusiasm for the series remains as gothic vampire fiction continues to be popular. In recent years, following the sale of Eidos properties to Embracer, Crystal Dynamics have shown an interest in reviving the franchise, so we can only hope that this vamp can finally rise from its grave once more. In fact, as evidence of this, much of the original series has seen a re-release for PS5. Both Blood Omen games are now available as classics releases, while both Soul Reavers have been released as a remastered collection. Over in the UK in the early 90s, a small developer known as Core Design were working on a new concept for the upcoming 3D consoles. Developer Toby Gard pitched an idea about a female adventurer, which caught some hesitance from publisher Eidos. He was not deterred, however, and even made sure his alternate male designs were so blatantly rip-offs of Indiana Jones that Eidos could not possibly use them, forcing them to relent and let him have his female lead. Originally released for the Saturn but soon ported to PC and PlayStation, the game would become a smash hit on these platforms. And that game was Tomb Raider. You already know Tomb Raider if you follow this channel, You'll have already been subjected to my endless videos on the series. If you haven't, please go watch the retrospective I did on the whole series. You'll get a lot more information there. It is a puzzle platformer action game about an adventurer named Lara Croft. Aside from its tough, puzzle-driven gameplay, the game was notable for being one of the first games to exclusively feature a prominent female character. Sure, some games featured female options, or there was Metroid with a secret female lead, but Lara very distinctly stood out. It was also a major part of the PS1's library. Despite being released for the Saturn first, the PlayStation is where the game really took off, with the association becoming so strong that the two immediate sequels would gain console exclusivity with Sony. Unsurprisingly, Lara Croft is the aristocratic archaeologist bot with her distinctive tank top and shorts. However, should be noted that the version seen in Astro Bot is in fact the new unified Lara design, combining elements of the original Lara with those from her younger redesign in the 2013 reboot onwards. This is indicated by the aforementioned shorts and tank top, sitting alongside a jade necklace and a ponytail instead of a braid. She is of course aristocratic in name due to her status as a lady with her own mansion and everything. This mansion features prominently across the series, acting mostly as a tutorial level in earlier games. She's also a Brit of an icon because not only is she British herself, but she was created by a British studio. Her full animation in the crash site adds a velociraptor that chases her around the level. This is a reference to the first game in the series and its iconic Lost Valley level, where Lara encounters a ton of raptors and a massive T-Rex. And trust me, Lara running away like that is basically me playing the game when I was 12. So it's accurate. Also, there's a possible extra layer here in the reference. Astro's Hub is the crash site, which is also the name of a level in Tomb Raider 3 that prominently featured raptors. I don't know if they did that on purpose, but I definitely noticed the connection. Lara's location in Astro Bot's levels is also a nod. She's found in the Hieroglyph Pyramid level, which is Egyptian themed like many of her games, but she's also found in an area where she's sneaking through a trap area trying to reach some treasure, similar to how walking in early Tomb Raider games was often a sensible way to avoid traps. Her inclusion as one of the bots is obvious. Tomb Raider was a pretty big series for decades. Its debut in the 90s was a huge deal, especially in the home country of the UK, where Lara was often pulled into the Cool Britannia movement along with Britpop, the Spice Girls, Trainspotting, and other major British cultural touchstones of the time. Lara's fame diminished a little after the release of 2003's Angel of Darkness, but the series still has a dedicated fanbase behind it. The series has since changed hands to Crystal Dynamics, who we just talked about in the previous section, and with the handover, the series has gone through 2 reboots and is currently gearing up for a unified game coming in the future. The original core design Tomb Raiders are available on PS5 via 2 remaster collections. You can also play Tomb Raider Legend, which recently got re-released, along with the Survivor trilogy that began in 2013, as these all released for PS4.
That's right! I'm in the house! Here it comes!
With the breakup of the band Psy-S, band member Masaya Matsuura got an interest in working in video games. He expressed his interest in working on music for games with Sony, who were looking for unique and interesting ideas for their new console. Sony introduced him to an artist named Rodney Greenblatt, who'd also expressed interest in game development, and the two started working together to produce a brand new type of game that combined their skills. The result was a game built around music, one where Greenblatt's characters were flat paper cutouts interacting with Matsuura's tunes. Due to Matsuura's interest in using sampling for the audio, he decided he wanted the game to be built around vocals, which quickly became rap. The main character was named Parappa after the Japanese word for paper thin, and because it worked with the word rapper. The result was the game Parappa the Rapper, one of the first notable rhythm games released for the PlayStation. Parappa was a small dog who worked with instructors who helped him learn new skills and improve himself. Their instruction took the form of raps, which Parappa would copy in a call and response fashion. Players controlled Parappa's responses, making sure he was rapping correctly and on beat. Failure to do so would lead to the song getting worse and ultimately being stopped entirely, or creative freestyling would allow Parappa to transcend into a cool mode, where the goal was to use the pre-programmed phases to improvise. Parappa was quickly adopted as a sort of mascot for the PlayStation, with his unusual gameplay and fun designs capturing the attention of many. Parappa would become an iconic figure for the system, receiving both critical and commercial acclaim. Unsurprisingly, Parappa is a bot in Astro Bot. Named the Love-Struck Lyricist, he features Parappa's trademark beanie and baggy pants, and can be found dancing around in the crash site, similar to how he appears in the game's intro. His name derives from his reason for wanting to improve himself to be a more impressive man for his girlfriend, Sunny Funny. Oh, one extra detail about the Parappa bot is that if you give him a whack in the crash site after obtaining his microphone, he will do a breakdance freeze and say, this is a reference to Parappa's catchphrase and main motto. After encountering a crisis in each level's intro, he'll realise that it is possible to overcome this problem.
Yeah, I know. I gotta believe!
Speaking of the microphone, its description lets people know that you got the funky flow. This is a reference to a lyric in the game's third stage, where a flea market Rasta frog teaches Parappa about money management. Parappa is a weird game, in case you hadn't realised this. If you complete Astro Bot's final challenge level, you unlock the Lyrical Master, or more specifically, Chop Chop Master Onion. This is the first instructor that Parappa works with in the original game. He's a karate master who teaches Parappa not only karate, but how to be more mindful. More specifically,
Kick, punch, it's all in the mind.
which is also in his description. He can be found meditating in his dojo in the crash site, which is the same dojo he teaches Parappa in, and if hit, he'll do some karate moves and make a distinct noise. This is the intro to his song from the original game, recreated in bot form. Parappa would receive a PS2 sequel in 2001, but it did also gain a PS1 spin-off called Jamalami. The gameplay of this game was similar to Parappa, only now you're placed in the shoes of Lammy, a sheep guitarist. She is also a bot in Astro Bot, known as the Shredding Sheep. Her gacha item is her guitar, which has a description that says it's not in her mind. This is a reference to how most of the levels in the game see her solving problems by imagining things like a fire hose or a chainsaw to be a guitar that she's rocking out on, providing her with confidence. Also, she plays it left-handed, exactly like the original game, which is a neat detail. Parappa remains a beloved PlayStation icon, although the series itself has been dormant for a while. Most of this is down to developer Nana Onsha going off and working on other projects, and the rhythm game scene getting significant changes over the years. He does still crop up in remasters and merchandise, but it's unlikely we'll see a new game anytime soon. A remaster of Parappa the Rapper was released for PS4 and is playable on PS5, as well as a port of the sequel. Jamalami, sadly, is not available. Developer MediEvil produced a number of early PS1 titles, including Crime Crackers and Rapid Reload. These were sci-fi action games which mostly only attracted attention in Japan. However, after this, they set their sights on a vast, sprawling RPG, and while they didn't fully drop the sci-fi elements, a new inspiration distinguished it from its peers, a setting based heavily on westerns. Wild Arms saw you playing as a party of 3 characters, each with their own backstory. Cecilia Adelheid is a princess studying at an abbey prior to her ascension into the royal family, until she discovers forbidden knowledge that reveals her ability to speak to the spirit dimension. Jack Van Buren is an adventurer accompanied by his Windmouse Hanpan, who learnt of ancient technology that he is eager to get his hands on. Finally, there is Rudy Roughnight, an orphan teenage boy who possesses a forbidden ancient weapon known as an arm, and the reveal of this leads him to be cast out of his village. The 3 of them meet and find they share similar goals, causing them to team up and venture across the world, uncovering secrets around a lost race, and ultimately coming face to face with the demons that threaten to destroy the world. Wild Arms is generally considered to be one of the greatest JRPGs released for the PS1, and while it did gain a lot of critical success, it was ultimately overshadowed by a certain other RPG that released around the same time. We will not be mentioning that game at all in this video. Putting aside all that strife, Wild Arms is Sony's own RPG, one that's beloved by many who have played it, so unsurprisingly one of its main cast is in Astro Bot. Rudy appears as the Dream Chaser, the title given to wanderers such as him in the original game. His description, along with the name and description of his gacha item, are all references to his weapon of choice. Arms were ancient relics used by a highly advanced precursor race, although their use in the game story is forbidden, causing Rudy to be cast out of his home when he is discovered to use one. His default arm is the hand cannon, which is pretty similar to the gacha item name because that's the same weapon that the Dream Chaser bot wields. He will fire it when hit, although a flower comes out. I'm not 100% sure on what this is referencing, but it could be the small flower item that raises luck, or a reference to the flower girl Marielle, who is the last of the ancient race who guides the party to the Elwa dimension later in the game. Another thing to notice that if you stand close to him in the crash site, you can hear mysterious whistling, which is similar to that heard in the music of the crash site itself. This seems to be a reference to the similarity between that music and the music of Wild Arms, both of which were inspired by the work of Ennio Morricone, who soundtracked many popular westerns and whose sound has become synonymous with the genre. Sadly, neither Cecilia nor Jack show up as bots, despite the whole trio being important to the story, which is disappointing. As stated, Wild Arms gained a huge amount of critical success and a decent amount of commercial success, enough to produce no less than 4 sequels that explored the world of Phil Gaia more. Wild Arms also received a PS2 remake known as Alter Code F. The series has been dormant since that console generation, however. The first 3 Wild Arm games are all available to play on the PS5. If there's one thing the PS1 was oddly full of, it was experimental puzzle games. This was due to Sony's willingness to invest in basically anything that seemed like it would fit the system at the time. This included a project designed by Masahiko Sato, a professor at the Tokyo University of the Arts. They scooped it up and offered developmental help to bring it to fruition. This project was Intelligent Qube, or Kurushi for the Europeans for some reason, a puzzle game about capturing rotating cubes on a grid. You play as a man trapped in this hopeless void, and you clicked floor panels to set traps for the rolling cubes. Some of these cubes offered extra bonuses while others were forbidden and must be allowed to roll away. The game was also notable for having a strangely soaring orchestral score instead of a standard electronic track that puzzle games at the time were known for. Intelligent Qube is represented in Astro Bot by a bot whose head is the cuboid level layout from the game. It looks incredibly weird, and it gets weirder once you add the man and the puzzle blocks, who the bot is controlling. The man and the blocks can be knocked off by smacking the bot, and they fall similarly to the failure states of the original game. Outside of this, Intelligent Qube is a weird experimental curiosity of the PS1 days that didn't have a major influence. It might be recognised by people who played the bundled demo disc that came with the console, and it did win an award at the Japan Media Arts Festival in 1997. Outside of that though, you may not be aware of this one. That said, despite its obscurity, it is available to play on the PS5. It's the 1980s, and Konami employees wanted to make a game that made players feel like they were inside a classic monster movie. That game would hit the Famicom in 1986 and then the NES a year later, changing its name from Akamaju Dracula to Castlevania. The game was a hit, and Konami would follow it up with a ton of sequels and spin-offs before landing on the PlayStation in 1997. After a failed 32X game, director Tori Hagihara switched to developing a sequel to 1993's Rondo of Blood for Sony's system. However, he would be promoted to division head during its production, leaving his assistant to take over. That assistant, Koji Igarashi, would completely redefine what a Castlevania could be. The previous games were straightforward 2D side-scrollers, but for the new entry, Igarashi wanted to expand it. He felt that games in general were too short and wanted something that players could really spend a lot of time with. He took inspiration from the Zelda series and the non-linear structure of Castlevania 2, slapped RPG mechanics on to balance the challenge, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night was born. This saw some drastic shifts away from the classic formula. While still a side-scroller, progression through the game was non-linear, with multiple routes open to the player and new routes opened as they uncovered new abilities. Like most games in the series, the goal was to find and kill Dracula in order to end his reign of terror. Only this time, you played as his son, Alucard, who ventured into the castle to find out what's happened to Richter Belmont after he defeated the head vampire years before. Both Alucard and Richter are bots in Astro Bot, with Alucard as the Dandy Dampier and Richter as the vampire killer. Richter's name alludes to the role of the Belmont clan, who always rise to take down Dracula using the family heirloom, a whip named Vampire Killer. This heritage is also referenced in his description, which says that he's from a long line of candle smashers, which is a reference to how traditionally you could find items by smashing the various candles that line the wall of Dracula's castle. His gacha item is the Vampire Killer's Sanctuary, which is interesting because it's really the opposite of that. This appears to be Dracula's throne room, which appears in the prologue where you play as Richter and face off against Dracula.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. How about you?
However, it makes another appearance with Richter in the seat for the final boss of the game. That is, until you find the Holy Glasses and discover that Richter has been possessed by the Dark Priest that's a sex machine to all the chicks. Shaft. This is referenced in Richter's appearance, where he sits menacingly in his throne, but will snap out of it when hit and immediately whip the skeletons surrounding him, which would be his usual reaction to encountering skeletons like this. Alucard's name references the fact that he is the son of Dracula and a human woman named Lisa, making him a Dampier, or a half-vampire. This is why he sleeps in a coffin, which is also what he rests in at save points throughout Symphony of the Night. The opening crawl also states that he has awoken from an eternal slumber to help save the day, which probably explains why all his animations see him waking up in Astro Bot. Him waking to save the day is also what makes him the opposite of his father, as stated in his description, as his frequent collaboration with humans is a direct contrast to Dracula's hatred for mankind. He even gets chastised by death early on for this. Alucard's bot appearance is a silly one, as he has 3 different animations if you rouse him from his coffin. None of them feel like direct references, but I'm going to do my best anyway. First, he will wake up with bed hair and desperately brush it out. This is most likely down to Symphony of the Night debuting the art of Ayami Kojima, whose Bishonen style made everyone aggressively beautiful. Alucard isn't this openly vain about his hair in the original game, but just look at him. You know he browses the hair products aisle and frequently says, "I'm interested in this." The second animation sees him being woken by an alarm clock. If we overthink this, and I will, it could be a reference to the stopwatch subweapon, which is also a clock, or it could reference the importance of the castle's clock tower, so there's another clock connection. I know it's probably just an alarm clock, but I'm going for it anyway. The third animation sees him woken up by a rooster instead. I like to think this is a reference to the original recipe Castlevania wall chicken, which healed you if you found it. You could even find one in Symphony of the Night, although here it became a turkey. Castlevania Symphony of the Night was a massive critical success upon launch.
You like Castlevania, don't you?
Critics did like Castlevania, thank you, although it took a while before the audience caught up. The game initially sold poorly, but over time it has come to be known as one of the greatest games ever made. The series would continue for a good few years, with Symphony of the Night acting as the template for every game that would follow. It would also become half the template and name for an entire genre of video games, as the Vania part of Metroidvania refers to this game specifically. While Castlevania has been relatively dormant since 2010, it's been making a resurgence lately with a popular Netflix adaptation and a bunch of crossover content in other games. Castlevania Symphony of the Night received a re-release with Rondo of Blood as Castlevania Requiem exclusively on PS4, so naturally it's playable on PS5 as well. Various other Castlevania games are also available on PS5 via 3 separate collections.
Thank you.
Early in the PlayStation's life, several team members from the Mega Drive game Landstalker were looking to make a spiritual successor for the PlayStation. Unlike other games of the time which pushed heavily for 3D visuals, this game was aiming to emulate the Zelda franchise. In other words, 2D sprites, a top-down view, and a lot of puzzles. That game was Alundra. Alundra is essentially what would happen if Zelda went completely out of its way to avoid being child-friendly. While on first glance it absolutely looks and occasionally feels like a follow-up to A Link to the Past, the story was much, much darker. It was a game that saw the deaths of countless NPCs, solemn themes of grief and tragedy, and ultimately ruminations on the endurance of the human spirit. It is also one of my personal favourite games of all time. Somehow, Alundra himself is a bot in Astro Bot. Referred to as the Dreamwalker, Alundra wields the Sword of Dreams, which allows him to banish nightmares and help you get a good night's sleep. This is accurate to his home game, as Alundra was part of a race of people who could enter other people's dreams. This ability shows up repeatedly throughout the game's story, as Alundra attempts to banish the nightmares of Inoa Village. I will say that sometimes his efforts did result in a slightly more permanent sleep than some would have liked, so the description is only partially accurate. I'm not sure where the Sword of Dreams thing comes from though. The sword in the game is just called a sword. Alundra is one of the PS1's hidden gems. It wasn't a massive hit, but those who did play it absolutely fell in love with it. The idea of the game getting representation at all is astounding to me, as this game is largely forgotten. But Sony were its original publisher in Japan, and Psygnosis published it in Europe, who were owned by Sony, so it is effectively a deep cut of the first-party library that Asobi clearly felt deserved some extra attention. I certainly welcome its inclusion. That said, Alundra is not available for the PS5. As I'm sure you've noticed, normally I lead these sections by talking about the history of a game's development, but this time I'm going to work backwards and propose an investigation into a specific bot. This little football boy. He's a robot who plays football. His name is Star Striker. He could be literally anyone from a football game. He could represent FIFA, the most successful of all the football franchises. He could represent This Is Football, Sony's own short-lived franchise on the PS1 and PS2. His placement on the bot list doesn't help, as he's grouped with two other generic sports people. While those two I can more cleanly point to a specific series, this guy's much harder because he's a football boy. But wait, when you unlock his football from the gacha machine, it says that no winning 11 can score without it. Okay, I have a theory about which specific series this is supposed to represent. Konami released International Superstar Soccer Pro for the PlayStation in 1997. While FIFA had already started by this point and was considered the big dog in the genre, ISS Pro gave it a run for its money, often considered by many to be the superior football game despite its lack of licensing. How it's better I don't know, but that's what I hear. The series has been going strong on PlayStation ever since, although it changed its name to Pro Evolution Soccer in 2001 and became eFootball in 2020. And yeah, it's a football game. You play football. 22 men kick a ball around for 90 minutes and try and score some goals. I'm sure you understand how this works, except the Americans, for whom football is a different sport entirely. But why do I think it's this series specifically? It's easy, because the Japanese name for the series, which has been consistent unlike the Western one, is Winning 11, just like in the description. Apparently it's important enough to warrant representation in Astro Bot. Don't ask me, I get that sports games sell a lot, but I hardly feel like many players are getting excited over a generic football man. Still, at least the bot gets a silly fake injury animation for when you hit him, although it's still definitely more a nod to real footballers over anything specific from a game. Anyway, the latest in the series that's playable on PS5 is eFootball 2024. Enjoy if you're into that sort of thing, I guess. Alright, are we done here? Can we move on to something that isn't sport?
Good shot!
Oh, this is awkward. Well, we all know about Mario's love of sport, from golf to tennis to assorted other sports. It's a long-running tradition that persists to this day. But that's Nintendo. What does Mario Golf have to do with PlayStation? Well, the developer of Mario Golf was Camelot Software, and it was not their first attempt at making a cartoony and accessible golf game for casual audiences. Prior to Mario Golf, they developed a game for Sony, a golf game for everybody. Or perhaps you could call it
Everybody's golf.
Or if you're American, you'd call it Hot Shots Golf, but that doesn't work in that sentence, and anyway, I'm sticking with the Japanese and European title here. Everybody's Golf released in 1997 with a singular goal: to be a golf game that anyone could pick up and enjoy. To enable this, the cast of characters were cartoony and welcoming, the mechanics were simple, and the vibes were chill. It was, to put it simply, a golf game. You took to a course, you whacked some balls around, and tried to get those balls in the appropriate holes within a certain number of strokes. The Everybody's Golf series has been a persistent presence in Sony's catalogue, although development shifted over to the studio Claphands from the second game onwards. Almost every Sony system has at least one game in the series, except for the PS5. I'm unsure how well the series typically does, but they're fun little golf games that clearly have an audience who loves them. Which is why there's an Everybody's Golf bot in Astro Bot. It's not based on any specific character from the series as far as I can tell, although there have been plenty of female characters in skirts and visors that this could be referencing. Her description mentions a love for birdies, a reference to the golfing terminology of birdies being one shot under par, while the mentions of eagles and albatrosses refer to scores of 2 and 3 under par respectively, as they are larger than birdies. I am not good enough at Everybody's Golf to get either of those, so please enjoy the birdie footage and pretend it's the other two. The gacha item is, unsurprisingly, a golf club. Specifically, it's a wedge based on its name and description. The name refers to the use of a sand wedge to get out of bunker traps on a golf course, and its description describes its use. The golfer's use of it in the crash site is appropriate with all the sand, much like a bunker. When hit, the bot will knock their ball straight up in the air, which is an exceptionally bad shot, but not a specific reference. As stated, Everybody's Golf continues to hang around, offering a fun little sports game for casual audiences. It even had a VR version. It's not clear if we'll see more from the series, however, especially with Claphands off making golf games for other platforms. Everybody's Golf 1 and 2 are available as PS1 classics on the PS5, World Tour for the PS3 is available to stream, and the PS4 reboot is also available through backwards compatibility. Lorne Lanning had a vision. Working as a graphics artist at Rhythm & Hues, a Hollywood studio making computer graphics for movies and theme parks, he got the idea to write a series of stories. Inspired by the injustices of the world, he envisioned 5 of these stories, each about a strange alien creature at the bottom of their world's hierarchy, all finding ways to rise up and get revenge on their oppressors. The written stories were fine, but as a 3D artist, he wanted to bring them to life. And with the help of producer Sherry McKenna, he founded a games company in 1994 with the goal of bringing the quintology of stories to life. The developer was named after his characters, who were all inhabitants of a planet known as Oddworld. The first of the Oddworld quintology of games would see the light of day in 1997. Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, saw a slave worker in a meat factory discover a secret so dire it would lead him to rise up against his masters, bring down the whole operation, and save his people. Driven by Lanning's anti-capitalist worldview, the game did not see you playing as an all-powerful hero. Instead, it starred Abe, a skinny little guy who used sneaky tactics to achieve his goal, all wrapped up in some goofy, dark humour to make the political messaging a little bit more palatable. The game itself was a cinematic puzzle platformer, where Lanning's experience in 3D animation was put to great use. With limited combat abilities, Abe had to use stealth and cunning to get around his enemies. Players could also encounter other members of his species, the Modokans, who could be saved by talking to them and guiding them to special exit portals only he could open. He could also possess enemies and lead them to kill their friends and themselves in hilariously gruesome ways. The game was a massive success. It was an impressive technical feat thanks to its high quality animation, and the game's comedy and brutal challenge were both highlights for many players. Oddworld would quickly become one of the most beloved PS1 games. Astro Bot references Oddworld with 3 identical bots: the Madokan Liberator, the Madokan Follower, and the Madokan Minion. While they all look identical, the fact that one of them is the Liberator suggests that he might be Abe himself. The description for the Follower is a reference to Oddworld's GameSpeak mechanic, where Abe would encourage others to go with him by simply saying,
"Follow me, okay."
When you have all 3, you can find them in the crash site sneaking back and forth. Sneaking was a mechanic for getting through areas without being heard. Normally, Abe would make big clunking footsteps, but with the sneak button held down, he would move into a cartoonish tiptoe animation that would silence his steps, but he would also move slower. When hit, the Madokans will all briefly roll around on the floor. I'm not entirely sure what's happening here, but it could be simply a reference to Abe's roll move where he curls up into a ball and rolls through small gaps. However, what happens after a Madokan gets back up is much clearer. He will fart, and the other 2 Madokans will laugh. There is no better way to put this. Oddworld Abe's Odyssey has a fart button. It largely serves no purpose other than to do it in front of Madokans to make them laugh. It did gain a purpose in the sequel, Abe's Exodus, where Abe would have literal explosive farts that could be possessed and moved into areas you need to blow something up. The farting is also referenced in both of the other Madokan descriptions, which mention not pulling the Liberator's finger, and the minion laughing at the same joke, which is a reference to Madokans finding Abe's farts hilarious. Even now, Lorne Lanning is determined to realise his vision of the Oddworld universe. While only 2 Quintology games have seen the light of day, with Munch's Odyssey for the Xbox being the second, a bunch of other games have all appeared over the years, including a Western-inspired spin-off, a remake of the first game, and a reimagining of Abe's Exodus called Soulstorm. It's not clear what's next for Oddworld, but it's clear that Lanning wants to keep expanding this world he's created. Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, and Abe's Exodus are available on PS5, along with the reimagined New and Tasty and Soulstorm. Argonaut were technical wizards in the early 1990s. After finding a way to hack the Game Boy's copy protection system, they informed Nintendo, which led to the development of an impressive pseudo 3D game for the handheld called X. This would lead them to working directly with Shigeru Miyamoto to make Star Fox and the Super FX chip that powered it. With this relationship established, Argonaut approached Nintendo with another concept: a 3D platformer starring everyone's favourite dinosaur sidekick, Yoshi. However, despite the initial enthusiasm, Nintendo would ultimately reject the proposal around the same time that they cancelled Star Fox 2's release. This put Argonaut into an awkward position and ultimately ended the relationship between the 2 companies. However, Argonaut had a prototype for a 3D platformer. If they could just retool it and release it without a Nintendo IP, then it wouldn't have gone to waste. And so, a young computer artist named Simon Keating, working for Argonaut as his first job in the industry, was tasked with replacing Yoshi. Instead of straying too far from the green lizard concept, Yoshi became Croc, a cute little crocodile with a snaggletooth based on Keating's cat. The 3D platformer, which initially released for PlayStation, was now Croc: Legend of the Gobos, where our little crocodile friend sets out on a quest to save his fuzzball friends, the Gobos. Each level was a small platforming challenge where side rooms offered up collectibles and secrets. It played a little bit like Tomb Raider, with tank controls instead of the freeform movement of other 3D platformers coming in at the time. Croc even got a little backpack, just like Lara Croft. Croc is a late addition to Astro Bot as a fellow little guy with a PlayStation connection. He's the Gobo Defender, a clear reference to the Gobos of his game's title. These fuzzy little creatures were Gobos, a peaceful race of cuties who raised Croc as a baby. When the evil Baron Dante kidnaps them all, Croc knows that he must repay their kindness by rescuing them and taking down Dante. Croc will stomp around the crash site, similar to his movement from his original game. When hit, he will jump into the air and slam into the ground. This is a reference to one of his primary attack moves, a stomp that was mostly used for breaking crates. Croc received mixed to average reviews at the time, but that didn't matter as the game was a huge commercial success. It gained a sequel and a few spin-offs, but the success didn't last forever. In 2004, Argonaut would go bankrupt and the studio was closed down. However, they did recently reform, so there's a chance that Croc may return. As proof of this, a remaster of Croc, Legend of the Gobos, is set for a PS5 release early in 2025. After great success with the Ninja Gaiden series at Tecmo, Hideo Yoshizawa moved over to Namco. Here he wanted to create a more cinematic, story-driven game and had the idea of building a game set in a world of forgotten dreams. He presented this idea to Namco, who liked it but wanted it to have a broad appeal, so a cute platformer with a meaningful plot was devised. After experimenting with different designs, artist Yoshihiko Arai drew a character combining a cat, a dog, and a rabbit that the rest of the team loved. They named him Klonoa, and his game became Klonoa: Door to Phantomile. Klonoa was a 2D platformer released for the PS1 in 1997, starring the titular character in a land of dreams known as Phantomile. Klonoa could jump and fire a beam from a magical ring possessed by his spirit friend Hupo, which allowed him to grab enemies and use them as projectiles or a platform to bounce off into the air. The goal was to chase down a dark spirit named Gadius, who wished to turn Phantomile into a land of nightmares. Klonoa wasn't the most innovative or unusual game out there, but it had buckets of charm and won over plenty of players for its fun, pseudo-3D exploration and adorable cast of characters. So it's not surprising that Klonoa appears as the Dream Traveller in Astro Bot, with his name referencing how he traverses a land of dreams. His description says that he speaks fluent Phantomilian, a reference to how characters in the game speak in a fictional language. His gadget item is the Gust Gem, which is his magical ring. The description of the item is a reference to how it's used to inflate enemies like balloons and can then be used as platforms due to how bouncy they become. Klonoa can usually be found sleeping in the crash site, occasionally waving the ring around. This is likely a reference to how Klonoa starts his game by waking up, the adventure kicked off by a prophetic dream. When hit, he will briefly float in the air before dropping back down and adjusting his hat. This float is a glide move that Klonoa can perform throughout his game that helps give a little extra distance to his jumps. Klonoa was a beloved game and sold well, even getting a sequel for the PS2. The game would also be remade twice, with a Wii version releasing in 2008, which controversially swapped out the fictional language for real ones, and the Klonoa Fantasy Reverie series in 2022, which was a much more faithful remaster-level remake of both games in the series. Outside of this, Klonoa hasn't seen a lot of action, but it's fondly remembered as one of the PlayStation's great platformers. Both Klonoa games are available on PS5 as the Klonoa Fantasy Reverie series collection. Okay, it is time to bring back Motor-Toon Grand Prix like I promised. I didn't really explain the bot's description, did I? Well, it'll all make sense once I talk about what the team got up to after those two games. Director Kazunori Yamauchi didn't really want to make cartoony kart races. He was a massive gearhead who was desperate to use the PlayStation's capabilities to replicate real-world racing right down to the finest detail. If his name sounds familiar to you, or if you're suspicious of the developer name Polys, then you may already know where this is going. Yamauchi was determined to make his realistic driving game and developed it alongside the Motor-Toon games. The realistic physics he was implementing in that game was really the testing ground for his true passion project. One featuring real-world cars, a full tuning suite, and a much more serious vibe. Remind me what that bot description said again? Oh yeah, right there. Gran Turismo. A reference to what Yamauchi's passion project would become, Gran Turismo. Out went the bouncy rubber hose visuals and in came sleek Nissan Skylines and Subaru Imprezas. No unique special characters, just faceless race car drivers in full gear. This is a serious racing game now, perhaps even the real driving simulator. After that, Polys would change their name to the more recognisable Polyphony Digital, and the rest is history. Gran Turismo is represented in Astro Bot by the Pro driver, whose description even references Gran Turismo's real driving simulator slogan. It's basically just a little bot in a helmet that has Gran Turismo branding driving around with a steering wheel peripheral. He's based on the driver avatars that later Gran Turismos would use, who are basically just anonymous people in racing suits and helmets. After all, they're not the draw here, the cars are. There's not a lot else to talk about this bot, to be honest, as even the special animation when you hit it is just a generic crash. Gran Turismo absolutely needed to be referenced though. It is Sony's all-time best-selling first-party franchise, and the first game is one of the best-selling PS1 games overall. Racing game enthusiasts are dedicated folks, and Gran Turismo does everything it can to serve them with sleek visuals, meticulously recreated physics, and a cool jazz bar vibe that lets you know that being a car fanatic is quite sophisticated, actually. Gran Turismo continues to this day, obviously, with Gran Turismo 7 launching for the PS5 as recently as 2022, and it continues to be updated. It's certainly not going anywhere, especially when it continues to sell as well as it always has. People like going really fast, it turns out. The original Gran Turismo is not available for PS5, instead you have Gran Turismo 7, the latest entry, or Gran Turismo Sport, a PS4 game. Despite being the man who initiated development for Resident Evil, Tokuro Fujiwara was unhappy at Capcom. Shortly after Resident Evil's release, he would leave the company to form a new one, named Whoopee Camp. The studio's first game was a side-scroller, one that distinguished itself with RPG-style systems like character growth and a quest log. That game was Tomba, a side-scrolling platformer RPG hybrid starring a feral child with pink hair called, Tomba. After encountering a group of pigs shaking down a merchant on the road, Tomba rushes in to help, but gets his grandpa's gold bracelet stolen in the process. Undeterred, he chases the pigs down, determined to get his bracelet back, and in the process becomes the hero to stop the pigs from wreaking havoc on the land. Tomba was a unique game in many ways. The structure was non-linear, similar to a Metroidvania, although NPCs were abundant and quests were handed out constantly as if it was an RPG. These quests earned the player points, which helped open rewards and new areas. Also, your attack was unconventional, as defeating enemies involved jumping on top of them and then flinging them away. Tomba makes an appearance in Astro Bot as one of the special Christmas editions, noticeable by his aggressively pink hair. He is the Wild Child, a reference to him living in the wilds like a caveman. His unusual nature is commented on a few times in his game, including the bright pink hair. Most of the rest of Tomba's references revolve around the Komi pigs. These were the primary antagonists of the game, made up of a group of evil pigs. They have been causing chaos across the land, ruining the wildlife, stealing goods from people, and generally making life a bit miserable. Tomba is unafraid to tackle them though, and this is why the pig in the crash site is so concerned by him jumping at it. This is because, as stated, this was his primary attack in the original game. Tomba was a fun little game for the PS1 that didn't gain a lot of attention, but did become a cult classic for many years to come. It managed to get a sequel, but this sadly failed to catch as much attention, and led to the closure of Whoopee Camp before they barely got started. A remaster of Tomba is available on PS5. Daisuke Ishiwatari loved Street Fighter 2 and wanted to make a game that took a lot of its concepts, but do something flashier and more geared towards hardcore players. He wanted big, bold characters and a visual style similar to anime of the time. His bosses at Arc System Works liked his plans, and handed him a team of 12 people to make the game. However, due to their inexperience, the game would take 3 years to produce, eventually releasing in 1998 for the PS1 as Guilty Gear. Guilty Gear is set in an alternate future of the world, where the timeline diverged from ours around the year 1999. Magic has replaced technology, and a race of beings known as Gears have been developed for use as living weapons. After a global war between humans and Gears, known as the Crusades, wreaked havoc on the world, The leader of the Gears, Justice, was sealed away in a dimensional prison. However, 5 years later, the threat of her return prompts the announcement of the second Sacred Order tournament, gathering 10 fighters together, the strongest of which will be tasked with taking down the threat. 2 of these fighters was Sol Badguy and Kai Kisuke. Sol is the protagonist of the Guilty Gear franchise, an immortal bounty hunter and one of the few sentient gears. Kai Kisuke is a high-ranking member of the Sacred Order of Holy Knights, the military force whose goal was to fight the Gears. Both characters have appeared in every Guilty Gear game and have acted as friendly rivals through much of the series. They also both appear in Astro Bot, representing the fact that the Guilty Gear series has almost entirely appeared on PlayStation systems, including as exclusives for a few games. Sol is the Gear Stalker, while Kai is the Holy Knight, a reference to their roles and titles within the Guilty Gear franchise. Sol is based on his appearance from the first Guilty Gear, with his gacha item being the Fire Seal sword he wielded in that game. He can be seen standing in the crash site with his sword in the ground, and he will occasionally crack his neck and do a thumbs down motion. These are references to his intro animation and then his victory animation in the first game. When hit, he'll perform a flaming uppercut with his sword. This is his special move Volcanic Viper, an anti-air move he has had since the beginning of the series. Kai is also based on his original appearance in the first Guilty Gear, with his gacha item being the Thunder Seal, his weapon from that game. When standing in the crash site, he will occasionally pull his sword up vertically, which could be a reference to either his intro or win pose from the first Guilty Gear. When hit, he'll perform a fully charged Stun Edge, his projectile move throughout the series. Guilty Gear is held in high regard among fighting game fans, with the series continuing to this day. After a long legacy of games, Guilty Gear Strive released in 2021 to widespread acclaim and continues to be supported with patches and new content to this day. The original Guilty Gear is on PS5, as are the Xrd games, and of course, the latest game, Strive. During the 90s, Sony held a competition in Japan called Game Eurose, designed to find new and interesting video game concepts to bring to market, despite what some have thought, including maybe someone like me who made a video that talked about this game in the past. This was not the same thing as the Net Eurose Homebrew Games Initiative. One of the 30 games produced through Game Eurose was a quirky little puzzle game called Devil Dice, or Shi, in its native Japan. In this game, you play as a little devil trapped in a void full of dice that grow from the ground. You need to make these dice disappear by matching the faces on the die by the number on the face. So for example, you need to match 3 3s or 4 4s and so on to make them disappear. As they disappear, you can slap more of the same face on the sinking pile to rack up more points. It was a surprisingly fun and compelling little puzzle game, a perfect little time killer for the PS1. Again, I even made a video about it on how meditative it is. Surprisingly, it's represented in Astro Bot by the Dice Tumbler, which is a bot dressed like the little devil character you play as. It can usually be found rolling a die around in the crash site, much like its home game. However, what's especially notable about this one is where you can find it. In the slow-mo casino level, you can enter a sub-level which resembles the original Devil Dice, complete with an isometric view of a field of dice. When you step on them, they sink into the ground just like their original game. Honestly, they put more work into this than they needed to do. Devil Dice was a modest hit and spawned a few spin-offs and sequels, including Bombastic on the PS2 and Shi Colosseum on the PSP in Japan. However, this is mostly a weird curiosity of the PS1, with the bot representing the quirky ideas that could often get spawned out of the system in the early days. However, Devil Dice is not available for the PS5. Our next series begins its life long before the PlayStation. In fact, over 10 years before making its PlayStation debut. In 1987, Konami released Metal Gear for the MSX2 computer, an innovative stealth game where combat was meant to be avoided as you infiltrated an enemy base. Both it and its sequel became cult classics in Japan, with its combination of unique mechanics and quirky characters. The director of these games, Hideo Kojima, decided to work on a third game in the series as early as 1994, with the goal of releasing on the 3DO console. However, after that console flopped, development moved to the PlayStation. To represent the transition of the series from 2D to 3D, the title became Metal Gear Solid. This transition, as well as the move from 3DO to PlayStation, meant that it would be another 4 years before the game hit store shelves. Metal Gear Solid starred the protagonist of the first two games, a soldier codenamed Solid Snake, being called back into action after his retirement. Terrorists have taken over a nuclear weapons disposal facility on Shadow Moses Island in Alaska and are threatening to launch a nuke if their demands are not met. They also have the chief of DARPA and the head of Arms Tech held captive, and it is Snake's job to infiltrate, rescue the hostages, and stop the terrorists. The game played a lot like the original two Metal Gear games with a top-down perspective, only now the camera was able to shift to more cinematic angles whenever necessary. Players had to sneak around cautiously avoiding alerting guards before facing off a rogues gallery of ludicrous terrorists in exciting boss battles. Metal Gear Solid was a massive hit upon launch. Its visuals were among some of the best seen on the PS1, the game featured stellar writing and voice acting surpassing most games of the time, and its more unusual design choices made the game really stand out. No other game was asking if you liked Castlevania or asking you to look up a character's phone number by checking the game case. It quickly revealed Hideo Kojima as a mad genius and became a shining star in the PlayStation catalogue. Metal Gear Solid gets a large amount of bot representation in Astro Bot. Solid Snake himself is the legendary mercenary bot, named for his fame as a mercenary within the series. In Metal Gear Solid, he's referred to by one of his support team as a living legend.
Nice to meet you, Snake. It's an honor to speak to a living legend like yourself.
His description refers to him as a terrible child, which is a reference to the revelation that Snake is a clone of the villain from the first two games, Big Boss, as part of a project known as Les Enfants Terribles, aka the Terrible Children. His gacha item is a cardboard box, an item that Snake can use across the series to comically sneak around. If you hit him while he's hiding in it, he'll pop out and look around while the iconic alert noise plays whenever Snake was seen by an enemy. Or you can sometimes find him looking at a naughty magazine, a likely reference to the Playboy magazines you can use to distract guards in Metal Gear Solid 4. But he is not the only Metal Gear bot in Astro Bot. There are two more from Metal Gear Solid, the Mystery Ninja and the Psychic Menace. The Mystery Ninja is Grey Fox, a former friend of Snake's who's been forcibly turned into a cyborg ninja. This is why he's stated to be neither enemy nor friend, as while he is fought as a boss, he also helps out Snake throughout the game. Also, he outright states this line himself.
Who are you?
Neither enemy nor friend.
He wields an electrically charged sword, which is naturally his gacha item. The description for the sword states that it's used with high frequency, a reference to how swords of this type are referred to as high frequency blades throughout the series. Once he has the sword, he will turn invisible in the crash site, a reference to his stealth suit in Metal Gear Solid that allows him to move around undetected. The pose he stands in is similar to a piece of official Yoji Shinkawa art promoting the game. The Psychic Menace is based on one of Metal Gear Solid's more infamous bosses, Psycho Mantis. This fourth wall breaking boss was a man with psychic powers who used this power to psychologically torture his enemies. His fight is well known among fans of the game for the way he used logic of video games against the player. He taunts them about what's on their memory card, and I already showed 2 clips of him doing that earlier in the video.
Oh, you like Suikoden. You like Castlevania, don't you?
He also reads your inputs unless you move your controller to the second player port. He also starts his boss fight by pretending to disconnect the console from the TV. This is why his gacha item is a PlayStation and a TV, referencing his fourth wall breaking status, and his ability to manipulate this to his advantage. The description references his ability to move the player's controller with his mind, or, more accurately, he vibrates it strongly enough to make it move if placed on a flat surface. This can also be seen in the bot animation. But we're not done with Metal Gear. After the success of Metal Gear Solid, more sequels were inevitable, The first of these was Metal Gear Solid 2, released for the PS2 in 2001, which presented one of the biggest trolls in gaming history, as Snake was quickly replaced in the game's narrative with a much younger agent named Raiden. Bear him in mind for now. After Metal Gear Solid 2, a third game was released in 2004, this time placing the player in the shoes of a younger Big Boss under the codename of Naked Snake, on a mission during the Cold War. This game would go on to be considered the best in the series, with its stealth mechanics stretched to a ludicrous degree, and the 60s setting providing a lot of political intrigue. Naked Snake is also a bot in Astro Bot, known as the Legendary Soldier, which also mentions that he would go on to become Big Boss. He also comes with a gacha item, the Hollow Hideaway. This represents a hollowed out tree trunk, which is one of the many ways that Snake can hide from his enemies in the game. Its description mentions that snakes can be found in them, both a pun on the character's name, and also because you're encouraged to hunt for wildlife for sustenance in the world, including snakes. Speaking of which, one of Naked Snake's hit animations is him tucking into a plate full of animals, which is also a reference to this. He also has two other animations when hit. The first is similar to Solid Snake's gun check, only now the gun is a banana. This may be a reference to the jungle setting and the food again, or it may be a reference to... hang on, we'll save that one for later, I think. Finally, he can also be seen crawling around in a crocodile hat, which is an item you can use to sneakily move through the swamps of Metal Gear Solid 3. Metal Gear Solid 4 would soon follow in 2008 for the PS3, which tried to tie various plot strands of the series together. It also, surprisingly, saw Raiden from Metal Gear Solid 2, I told you to bear him in mind, turned into a cyborg ninja like Grey Fox. This was such a popular decision that he would go to star in another game in 2013. Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance was a spin-off game developed by Platinum Games, a studio known for flashy action games. When with Raiden now a cyborg ninja, that's exactly the game they made with him. Raiden's appearance in this game inspired a fifth Metal Gear bot in Astro Bot, the Watermelon Buster. Taking Raiden's appearance from Metal Gear Rising, his name and gacha item both reference how the game's early demos often featured watermelons as a way to demonstrate the game's unique slicing mechanics. Watermelons do show up in the final game, but not as frequently as this boss suggests. Hitting him causes him to slice the melon in a variety of angles with his high-frequency blade, but this is a reference to the slicing mechanic of Metal Gear Rising, where you could chop your enemies into tiny little bits. The bot's description is also a direct quote of an infamous line delivered by the game's final boss, Senator Stephen Armstrong.
Nanomachines, son!
If you're not sure what he's referring to, nanomachines are often used as a catch-all explanation of all kinds of magical nonsense throughout the Metal Gear franchise, including Armstrong's hardened skin in that boss fight. It should be clear from all this representation that Metal Gear has always been an important franchise for PlayStation. Most of these games were originally PlayStation exclusive, and all of them were massive hits. The series was always innovative, weird, and fun in all the best ways, and made Hideo Kojima famous among video game nerds. Kojima would lead one final game after the ones mentioned, before being unceremoniously forced out of Konami. The Metal Gear series hasn't had much activity since, but we will be seeing more from Kojima later. Much of the Metal Gear series is available via the Master Collection Volume 1, which contains everything from Metal Gear to Metal Gear Solid 3. Metal Gear Solid 5 is also available, as it was a PS4 game. Sadly, neither Metal Gear Rising nor Metal Gear Solid 4 are currently on PS5. Insomniac Games formed in 1994 for one simple reason. Founder Ted Price had a dream of making his own video games. Initially named Extreme Software because it was the 90s and everyone was naming their company that, they changed it to Insomniac when it turned out that everyone really was naming their company Extreme, so they couldn't use it. Their first game was a Doom clone, which was the style at the time. It was called Disruptor. It's not particularly notable, although reviewers did praise the game at the time. It did sell really poorly though, so a sequel was absolutely not on the cards. The team did show promise, and Disruptor's publisher was willing to give them a go on something new. The follow-up project couldn't have been more different. Inspired by the growing number of younger players on PlayStation and the realization that the console didn't have its own Super Mario 64, Insomniac decided to make exactly that. Artist Craig Stitt suggested the idea of the protagonist being a dragon, and final designs for the character were created by Charles Zembillis, who they poached from Naughty Dog, who were working across the hall from them. With the main character in place, the team decided to use their dragon's wings to glide, allowing for greater freeform movement, which became a central design ethos for the game. The final product was Spyro the Dragon, a 3D platformer in the truest sense of the word. You played as the titular dragon, who is the only one who has not been turned to crystal by the evil, nasty Nork. And now, he has to venture out to save them all. The game was a technical masterpiece for the PS1, featuring open world environments and a lot of tricks to prevent the console's poor draw distance getting in the way of its expansiveness. It was also just a really charming game, with Spyro himself being a fun and endearing character, and the game's levels being full of secrets for the player to discover. As a result, it ended up being the opposite of Disruptor in yet another way. It was a massive commercial success. Spyro swiftly became a mascot character for the PS1, much like Crash Bandicoot from Insomniac's neighbours. This led to 2 more games developed in a similar fashion to Naughty Dog series, with Universal owning the rights, but Sony providing much of the publishing support. Spyro, of course, ended up in Astro Bot. Due to his quadrupedal nature, the Spyro Bot is more like Spyro himself just dropped into the game rather than it being a robot. His name is Fiery Artisan, a reference to his fire breath, and the fact that his home in the first game is the artisan's homeworld. His fire breath is also referenced when you give him a whack on the crash site, as he'll set fire to Astro in retaliation. The blackened appearance Astro takes on in response is similar to how enemies burn up in Spyro's own game. Spyro's description also features a reference to Skylanders, a series that would later be spun off from his own, the first game of which was called Spyro's Adventure. Spyro would star in 2 more hugely successful sequels on the PS1 developed by Insomniac, but much like Naughty Dog and Crash, the agreements between Sony and Universal would fall apart. Universal would take the IP away, developing mediocre sequels and eventually moving on to Skylanders, while Sony developed a close relationship with Insomniac. While Sony were initially unsuccessful in buying them out, like they did with Naughty Dog, Insomniac did go on to develop more games for them later. The original Spyro trilogy is only available on PS5 as the Reignited trilogy. In 1995, the designer of James Pond, Chris Sorrell, pitched an idea to Millennium Interactive, combining Ghosts and Goblins and A Nightmare Before Christmas. Originally pitched to be an arcade-style experience, the game shifted to a more Zelda-style adventure game once other developers got on board. After pitching the idea around the industry, one publisher liked the idea so much that they bought out the whole team. That company was Sony, and Millennium Interactive became Sony Cambridge Studio, and they immediately got to work fleshing out their game idea. Well, I say they fleshed it out, but the Nightmare Before Christmas influence did lead them to make their protagonist a skeleton. Wanting an unusual protagonist, they decided the skeleton was a failure who history elevated to heroic status, but his resurrection allows him to finally live up to the legend. His name,
Sir Daniel Fortescue.
And the game was MediEvil, a quirky little adventure game that released for the PS1 in 1998. You play as Sedan, a skeleton resurrected by an evil sorcerer who has set out to rule the land with an undead army. However, Sedan wants to become the hero that legend claims him to be, turning his story from the knight who got an arrow to the eye to the valiant skeleton warrior who saved the land of Gallowmere. The game saw Dan venturing across a range of weird and wonderful locations, battling zombies and other beasts with an array of weapons, including magic in later parts of the game. The game quickly drew a fan base due to its unusual setting and charming sense of humour, and it quickly became a cult classic for the PS1. So it's not really a surprise that Sedan appears as a bot in Astro Bot. His name, Eternal Knight, is a reference to his legendary status, where his story lives on, even when it isn't true. The description mentions him being a true hero, which he is by the end of the game, but the make no bones about it part is in line with the game's punny sense of humour. As a bot, he wields his sword and the silver shield, the second best shield type in the original game. He waggles his sword similar to his basic attack animation before doing a spin similar to a charge move from his home game. When hit, his head will fall off, which becomes a common occurrence in the second MediEvil, where he can use his head to sneak into places too small to reach otherwise. That second game was released for the PS1 in 2000, and Sony has attempted to revitalise the series twice, both with a PSP remake which featured a lot of changes, and a PS4 remake that was largely faithful to the original. However, unlike our heroic skeletal protagonist, the series has yet to receive its heroic comeback resurrection. Cambridge Studio suffered a similar fate, as they would release the commercially unsuccessful Ghost Hunter and Primal for PS2, before being turned into a subsidiary of Guerrilla, and ultimately closed down in 2017. You can play no less than 3 versions of MediEvil on PS5, with the original, PSP Remake Resurrection, and PS4 Remake all available. The early 90s were a time where 3D graphics were being pushed hard, and in 1992, Namco unveiled a fresh new 3D racing game to the world. This was SimRoad, which saw a limited Japanese release before being shelved as merely a prototype for the game that was to come. 8 months later, that game arrived, as they were determined to bring that game to market before Sega did an equivalent. It was also an ideal time to speak to Sega's upcoming rivals in the console market to discuss a port, especially as Namco were building strong relationships with Sony already. And this PlayStation port would go on to not just be a launch title for Sony's machine, but the first PlayStation game, at least if we go by catalogue number. And that game, all together now.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
The Ridge Racer series would keep trucking along during the 1990s, with constant releases for arcade and PlayStation. However, over time, the series would steadily gain a mascot. Since the beginning of the series, there had always been race queens present. These are models who would generally hang around the track looking pretty, because it was the 90s and that was just a thing at the time. These are a real thing, by the way. They weren't just invented by Namco for the series. However, Ridge Racer Type 4, the 4th PlayStation game in the series, was heavily marketed with the race queen Reiko Nagase. This was a short-haired Japanese woman who acted as the face of the game's Real Racing Roots 99 tournament, frequently depicted wearing a dress with the branding of said tournament. It's white with red triangles. She made an appearance in the game's intro cutscene and would even send you an email for winning the first 5 races for the Pack Racing Club team. She would appear across the series and even made an appearance in a PS2 tech demo, always acting as the promotional face of Ridge Racer. She also appeared in other Namco games, including Smash Court Tennis and Pac-Man Fever. Also, remember I mentioned Kei Nagase from Ace Combat? Reiko is her sister. Due to her prominence as a mascot in a series so closely tied to early PlayStation, she rightfully makes an appearance in Astro Bot as the racing model. Her description is a reference to Ridge Racer Type 4's intro movie, where she breaks the heel of her shoe while walking, and gets a ride from a driver from the Solvalu team. Her gacha item is the legendary RC Racer, an RC car version of the first Ridge Racer's cover car, the Kamata Fiera, with FA Racing livery. The movement of the car, especially when Astro interacts with Reiko, is a reference to the Ridge Racer series' central mechanic of drifting. Now, there is a point I do need to make here, and that is the placement of this section, which of course is based on the origin game of the character, not the series. However, Reiko's origins are kind of disputed, as Race Queen characters have appeared in various games before 1999, and Reiko herself may be a girl who briefly appears in the Rage Racer intro. However, this is all pretty ambiguous, so I settled on her first definitive appearance, which is also the one that the Astro Bot cameo is based on, which is Ridge Racer Type 4. That's why it's so relatively late in the video for a series that boasts the first PlayStation game. Ridge Racer was a big deal for PlayStation and Namco well into the PS2 era. It was emblematic of the close relationship between the two companies at the time, a relationship that still holds up well today, albeit less exclusively. Ridge Racer itself has mostly been shelved for now though, with the last mainline game being released in 2012. There are currently 2 Ridge Racer games available on PS5. Type 4, the game I based this entry on, and the PSP game Ridge Racer 2, which are both part of PlayStation Plus. While this video is primarily about the PlayStation division, it might surprise you to learn that the Sony Corporation does a lot more stuff. Yes, I know, I was shocked too. As well as stereos, TVs, and movies and music, Sony also have an R&D division that invests in new technologies. During the 1990s, Dr. Toshitada Doi and his team worked on developing a robot with artificial intelligence for consumer entertainment. Eventually, in 1998, they revealed that they were successful in developing AIBO, a robot dog, and a year later, the first model would hit shelves. More advanced models would follow in later years, including the ERS 1000 model, which adopted a more explicit dog-like appearance. While AIBO dogs are complex tools, they exist purely for entertainment, mimicking the behaviour of real dogs and providing enjoyment for those unable to keep a real dog as a pet. Both the original and ERS 1000 models of AIBO appear in Astro Bot, and they can be found in the Safari Park. They are the Pup Pal and the Pup Pal Plus, and both their descriptions reference them being dog-shaped robot buddies, with the ERS 1000 stating that it knows some new tricks due to its improved AI. They can also both be given a ball, a popular toy for them to play with. What does any of this have to do with PlayStation? Honestly, not a lot. However, I have 2 theories regarding their inclusion. The first is that all the characters you collect are robots, so why not bring in some actual robots made by Sony? Second, they embody the spirit of play in the same way that video games do. They're consumer entertainment married to tech advancements. It's an odd inclusion, and one that does not make a small degree of sense because AIBO have never been in any video games. Neither of the represented AIBO dogs are playable on PS5, as they are real-world robot dogs, and not video games. It feels like a fact lost to time, but the PlayStation didn't start out with a dual analog controller. However, as analog controls became more prevalent across the industry, Sony developed a new version of the PlayStation's controller, now with 2 sticks. There were 2 varieties, the dual analog and dual shock controllers, with the first one lacking a vibration feature. A team at Japan Studio got an early glimpse of the controller while they were planning out a new game, and instantly, creative director Susumu Takatsuka wanted to make a game that made use of both sticks. The concept involved creating gadgets that would use the motion of the sticks, and this soon got grafted onto a concept where you had to use those gadgets to catch monkeys. And so, in 1999, Ape Escape was released, giving the PlayStation its first DualShock exclusive game. The premise was simple: the apes have escaped, and you, a small child, has been loaded up with gadgets specifically designed to catch them. The first game starred Spike, who goes to visit his professor friend, only to find monkeys wearing special intelligence-boosting helmets are wreaking havoc, and at the centre of it all is a white monkey with even greater intelligence, who is the mastermind behind all of it. Ape Escape gets its own special level in Astro Bot, where a Spike bot hands Astro his monkey net and passes the torch to him for an entire level. Let's talk about the Spike bot first though. He appears based on Spike's appearance from the original Ape Escape, as indicated by his striped shirt and red hair with a blonde highlight at the front. He is the Monkey Stalker, a reference to how he spends all his time in the game chasing after monkeys with his net. His gadget item is a strange one though, as it's a cookie bowl. While there are no points in Ape Escape where he gorges himself on cookies, the snacks are a health item in the game, as Spike's health is represented with 5 cookies that break, while collecting more replenishes them. You can also find cookie jars as you go through, which will automatically give you 3 points of health. For Astro's stint as Spike, he wields the Monkey Net, one of the initial gadgets handed to Spike by the Professor. It's used for exactly one thing: catching monkeys. While Spike is also handed a lightsaber-esque stun club, This is absent from the Astro level, with the net serving its function with enemies. The Ape Escape level takes on the gameplay of Ape Escape, so let's discuss how that works. Ape Escape is a 3D platformer where you navigate a series of levels, each containing a specific number of apes. These apes will run away or attack you when they spot you, so smart tactics have to be employed in order to capture them all. Stealth moves, smart gadget use, and trickery all need to be used to make sure they don't escape again. Apes also come in many varieties. Some are timid and easy to catch, while others are armed to the teeth and will make sure you know it. The Astro Bot level mostly follows this structure. There are 9 apes on the island that you need to catch, all dotted around in various places, with different structures to provide a different challenge in catching them. You also have to catch 6 of them before you can exit the level, although you are free to catch the last 3 anyway. This is similar to how the levels operated in Ape Escape. Levels didn't have traditional exits, you could only leave by catching a quota of monkeys. Initially you only needed to capture a fraction of them to complete the level, but could return later to catch the rest. For example, the first level of Ape Escape contains 4 monkeys, but you only need to catch 3 of them on your first visit. In fact, the 4th monkey cannot be caught until later in the game when you acquire the Skyflyer gadget, which allows you to temporarily fly. Similarly, there are some sections in Ape Escape where you cannot progress beyond a specific door because you need to catch a certain number of monkeys first. The Astro Bot level seems specifically based on the first level of Ape Escape 2, as they both featured a circular area with a giant ape version of the Statue of Liberty at the centre. Some of the surrounding structures are similar too, although it's not an exact replica. To help you find monkeys, especially as levels got bigger, the Professor handed Spike a monkey radar at the start of the 4th level of the original game. This was a device that Spike could activate to give an indication of the direction a monkey could be found in. You rotated the dish until you got a strong signal and headed off in that direction. Astro also gains access to this device, which serves the same function, although it plays hot and cold with you when you hold down L2. However, pressing L2 in the original Ape Escape revealed the monkey radar's second function. If you had a strong monkey signal, you could tap this button and the camera would switch to a view of the monkey, plus its stats and a name and a description. The name and description are conveniently similar to how bots work in Astro Bot, so naturally, every ape you capture in this level is their own bot with a name and description. Now, I did my best to see if any of these are direct references, and the honest answer is, they don't appear to be. I did find some loose connections though. The natural ape can be found relaxing in a deck chair, which isn't too dissimilar to monkeys that can be found in beach levels doing the same thing. The ape resembling the Thinker statue feels like a specific reference, but I failed to find this ape in any of the main 3 games. Did find plenty of apes curled up or sitting in meditative poses, so this may just be a natural extension of this. The banana-related apes don't have specific references either, instead these all appear to be natural extensions of the ape's love of bananas that shows up throughout the games. Most obviously, they will throw banana skins down as a way to get Spike to trip up and not catch them. One ape seems to think he's Spike, as he's somehow gotten hold of a monkey net of his own and is trying to catch butterflies with it. The closest I could find to this was a monkey named Spork or Gakaru in Ape Escape 3's hide-and-seek forest level, who's wearing the same clothes as Spike. The 3 apes and a band may be a general reference to Ape Escape 3, where the apes all decided to run their own TV station. This meant a lot of apes jumping in roles of presenter or actor, although as far as I can tell, none of them formed a band. However, there are taiko drummers to be found in the Winterville level of the game. The skywalking ape, however, is a highly specific reference, and one that I hinted at earlier in this video. Remember how I mentioned Naked Snake was holding a banana gun in the Metal Gear section? Well, allow me to introduce you to one of the strangest crossovers in video game history. Both Ape Escape 3 and Metal Gear Solid 3 contain modes that reference the other game. Somehow. In Ape Escape 3, there is Metal Gear Solid, where the gameplay of Metal Gear is emulated via an ape dressed in Snake's sneaking suit on a mission to save the real Snake, who you get to meet in a ridiculous closing scene. In Metal Gear Solid 3, the Snake vs Monkey mode saw Solid Snake recruited to take over the monkey catching for a while, using his stealth abilities to collect a bunch of monkeys that have stumbled into the jungles of the main game. The crossover is absurd, but the ape in a cardboard box and Naked Snake's banana gun are almost certainly references to the existence of this crossover. which is hilarious. Finally, once you've caught all the monkeys, a path up to the top of the statue appears, where you face off against the final ape, Spectre. Spectre is the main villain of the Ape Escape franchise, a white monkey from the circus who is the first to come into contact with the peak point helmet and become intelligent. Or more specifically, he became a maniacal genius with designs of taking over the world. Unlike the other apes, he's capable of human speech, and even has a cool anime villain look to distinguish him. In the UK version of the original Ape Escape, he even had a stereotypical British villain voice, because of course he did.
No longer will humans be the dominant species. I'm going to conquer the world!
The fight against him in Astro Bot is similar to the final boss fight of Ape Escape, where you head up to a large floating platform where he can be found in a floating throne. In the original fight, the first phase saw him flying around the platform, firing shots at Spike, and you had to shoot him down with your slingshot. This has been changed in Astro Bot to him throwing enemies at you to defeat before moving on to the final phase. In the original final boss fight of Ape Escape, Spectre surrounded himself with an energy shield that you had to break in order to weaken him and make him easier to capture. In Astro Bot, this has been simplified as he now just races around the outside of the platform and you just need good timing to get him. Also, one final reference that shows up in the level is a hula hoop that Astro as Spike can pull out as an idle animation. This is the super hoop or dash hoop gadget depending on which version you are playing, which can be spun around Spike fast enough to give him a shielded boost move. With this you could catch up to fast monkeys, climb steep slopes, and generally just dash around. And with that, I think we've covered everything there is to cover around Ape Escape. Ape Escape was a decently big franchise for Sony during the PS2 era, although much of its popularity came from Japan. This is why some later games in the series never released in the West at all. However, not much has been seen of the series since the PS3's motion-controlled spin-off game. However, with this level, hopefully it will lead to Asobi being handed the keys to make a new one, since this level makes it clear that they would love to. The first two Ape Escape games are playable on PS5, as is the PSP remake of the first game, and two Ape Academy games. There's not a lot of info on this game, which seems to have materialised one day on the PlayStation in 1999 and simply refused to elaborate. Incredible Crisis is about the Tana Matsuri family, an ordinary group of people just trying to get home for the grandmother's birthday celebration. However, each member of the family finds themselves encountering increasingly ludicrous obstacles to getting home, each one dealt with in a different minigame. The family consists of 4 members: Mother Etsuko, son Tsuyoshi, daughter Ririka, and the most relevant to our video, Father Taneo. Taneo's story sees him in the office when a construction crew drops a large spherical structure and causes it to smash through the office. Once he's safe from this, Taneo ends up in an ambulance where he gets thrown out on a stretcher. Things only escalate from there, including shooting at the military for attacking a UFO. Each of these events is represented as a mini-game, from button-mashing games to get away from the boulder-like object, to a quiz game and endless runner for the ambulance section. Somehow, Taneo is in Astro Bot as the unlucky salaryman, reading his newspaper in the most stereotypical salaryman dad way possible. His description says it's one thing after another with him, which is representative of the random events that occur in his original game. His gadget item is his newspaper, the description of which references events that occur in Incredible Crisis that would sound ridiculous if someone just read about them in the paper and didn't witness them for themselves. UFOs appear frequently throughout each family member's story, from Taneo having to shoot them down to Ririka communicating with them in a Close Encounters of the Third Kind fashion. One of the things the UFOs are up to is shooting random enlarge and reduce rays everywhere, with a giant teddy bear being one of the major effects of this, which Etsuko must help shoot down in a military jet after she's escaped a bank robbery. Don't ask. The bear also shoots its own rays, which Tsuyoshi gets caught in and is shrunk down to the size of an ant. I honestly cannot tell you how or why Incredible Crisis got represented. I'm not sure. It's a Sony first-party game, and in fact, I can't even find who owns the rights to it. But in a way, that feels very on-brand for the game itself. It's something quirky and odd that offers little explanation for itself, so sure, why wouldn't it show up here? The game's lead scenario director would go on to work for Nintendo, working on the Chibi Robo series and Captain Rainbow, which weirdly makes sense. That said, It is kind of an interesting inclusion just because it's one of those weird curios of the PS1 that made the PS1 such an interesting console. However, Incredible Crisis is not playable on PS5. In 1999, Sony in Japan released a device known as the Pocket Station. It was a mixture of a memory card and a personal digital assistant. If you were born after the 90s, a memory card is how you saved games on the original PlayStation, and a personal digital assistant was a short-lived electronic device that people carried around before smartphones were invented. Hope this helps. The Pocket Station allowed you to save data to it and play mini-games on the go, although the small calculator-style screen did limit the scope of those games. If you want to know what a Pocket Station looks like, think of the device you use to access the bot list in Astro Bot, and you literally have it. The Pocket Station never left Japan, and most games that used it stripped all functionality for the device during localization for the West. In fact, the most popular game for the device also never left Japan, and yet its lead character would become extremely important for Sony in the region. Doko demo Issho was a virtual pet game where you chose a Pokepi or a pocket person to care for, helping them learn words and meeting their basic needs. The Pocket Station functionality saw the device become a Tamagotchi, as you could take your Pokepi on walks. If you don't know what a Tamagotchi is, it was a little device that had a pet in it. Alright, I feel old making all these explanations, but I'm doing it anyway. Front and center of these Pokepi was Toro Inoue, a small white cat who desperately wished to be human. In fact, this is why he wants you to teach him words, so his language proficiency will make him more like us. He's a naive and sweet little guy who's just doing his best. Toro proved incredibly popular and was swiftly adopted as a mascot in Japan. He would show up frequently in marketing, and Sony Japan would celebrate his birthday every year. In fact, they still do. He also had a long-running series of games all the way up to 2012. In the West, he made some cameos. One of those cameos is, of course, Astro Bot. Here, he is the aspirational cat, whose name and description reference his dream of becoming human one day. His gadget item is the wrapping cloth, which is the bindle he carries with him on his travels to learn more about humans. He keeps it wrapped around his back, and it contains a countless number of items he can pick up. In some games, he even uses it as a shield to change into different costumes. When hit, several of these items will topple out of Toro, including a lot of sushi. This is a reference to Toro's backstory, where he was raised in a sushi shop, giving him a lifelong love of the food. Otherwise, Toro can be seen shielding his eyes from the sun and then leaning over, a reference to animations from his home games. You can also hear him meow, and all these sound effects are taken directly from his games. But Toro wasn't the only character in the Doko demo Issho games. In the PS2 game Toro to Ippai, Toro would come to live on a vacant lot with the Kuroneko, aka black cats. Eventually one of these would become a close friend of Toro's, and this bow-tie wearing buddy named Kuro would co-present a regular news show on PS3 with him. Kuro is also in Astro Bot as the Streetwise Cat, a reference to the original Kuroneko appearance as they lived on the streets. His description is a reference to his more brash personality, where he's addicted to gambling and drinking. When hit, his bow tie will fall off, a reference to how that's his only distinguishing feature against other Kuroneko, so losing it is a problem for his identity. Toro and his friends continue to act as mascots for Sony in Japan, even if there are now fewer games to go along with it. While a short-lived mobile game did materialise in 2019, these cats mostly show up in marketing materials or at events. Beckside, the developers for much of the game series, have been busy making independent projects in the meantime, including a HoloLive game. Just like I explained all the 90s things to you, you kids have to explain HoloLive to me. Sadly, despite his mascot status, none of Toro's games are available on PS5. Not in the West, at least. I don't know if they're in Japan. Long before the indie restaurant management games of today, long before Cooking Mama, there was a cooking game for the original PlayStation. Released in Japan in 1999, Ore no Ryouri, or My Cooking, was a frantic cooking game published by Sony themselves. You played as a chef, forced to run a restaurant on an island under the pretense of it being part of a cooking competition. You passed through a series of stages, working hard to manage the various aspects of a restaurant. You had to manage orders, flipping quickly between different steps of each one, from pouring beer to frying burgers. Interestingly, Ore no Ryouri has something in common with Ape Escape, as it's one of the few PS1 games that required a DualShock controller. All of your cooking actions are performed with a combination of stick pushes, with sensitivity and direction all playing a part in your success. Curiously, Ore no Ryouri has representation in Astro Bot, with the prodigious Chef Bot. He can be found chopping and cooking maniacally in the crash site. This is a reference to the general gameplay of Ore no Ryouri, which sees customers constantly coming in and their orders slowly ticking down. The chaos was part of the game's challenge, and you had to manage your time effectively in order to succeed. The chef's description says he's an enemy of cockroaches, which is a reference to one of the various disruptions that you'd have to deal with. Occasionally, non-cooking objectives would show up in your task list, such as calling the police, doing dishes, or, most importantly for this video, stomping on cockroaches invading the kitchen. Ore no Ryouri was a unique game for PS1, although it never left Japan. However, after a demo for the game appeared on the PlayStation Underground demo disc in North America, interest in fan translations sprung up after it turned out the game was never getting released. These fan translations would lead to the Ore no Ryoumi fan games, which would later become the legit indie game Cook, Serve, Delicious. So, while Ore no Ryouri was a one-off curiosity, its spirit lives on through that series. Ore no Ryouri is not available on PS5, but while it is an unofficial successor, Cook, Serve, Delicious will provide a similar experience and is available. Anthony Frank Hawke was born in San Diego in 1968 to parents Nancy and Frank. A hyperactive child, this led to him taking up skateboarding as a hobby. He showed such aptitude for the sport that he would become a pro by the age of 14. A long, illustrious career in the sport followed, and in 1999 he achieved two specific goals. The first of these was becoming the first skater to achieve the fabled 900 due to his skills on the vert pipe, and the second achievement was getting his own video game. Activision wanted to capitalise on the growing popularity of skateboarding and asked developer Neversoft to develop a game about the sport. Late in the game's development, the team signed Tony Hawk as the face of the franchise, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater was born. The game was an arcade representation of the sport, full of free-roaming levels where the goal was to rack up huge scores and complete special goals, ranging from collecting the letters of the word skate to wrecking public property. It featured a range of big-name skate pros and a soundtrack full of iconic rock and hip-hop songs from the 90s and early 2000s. Believe it or not, Tony Hawk appears as a bot representing the franchise in Astro Bot. And by that I mean he sort of appears. There's enough plausible deniability that avoids mentioning Tony by name or referencing anything too specific, and it's placed in the awkward generic sports section of the bot list. However, the bot's name is Pro Skater, much like his series, and hitting him in the crash site causes him to do a series of spins that total a 900-degree rotation, a clear reference to Hawk's big achievement. Plus, even if it's just referencing skateboarding games on PlayStation in general, ask any random person to name a skating game on Sony systems and they will inevitably reference Mr. Hawk and his shenanigans, because these games were massive. If you were an adolescent boy in the early 2000s, you owned at least one Tony Hawk game, and I am no exception to this rule, as I own 3 of them from that time. The series was a persistent presence throughout the 2000s, winning critical and commercial acclaim across the board. And it's still beloved to this day, with a remake of the first 2 games hitting consoles in 2020. I own that too, because of course I do. Tony Hawk himself is still determined to give the series a comeback, which is why Pro Skater 3 and 4 are also being remade. While the older Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games are not available on PS5, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 is. Japan Studio were one of the more active internal studios at Sony during the PlayStation era. Among titles like Gran Turismo and Ape Escape, the studio also managed to find time and resources to produce a huge, sprawling RPG. However, the team wanted the game to feel grounded despite being a fantasy, with realistic visuals and magic contained to specific moments, rather than usable all the time. This became the concept of characters with the power of dragons, and the Legend of Dragoon was born. After 3 years of development, the Legend of Dragoon released for the PS1 in late 1999. It starred Dart, a young man who sets out on a quest after his hometown is destroyed by a foreign army and his childhood friend is imprisoned. After freeing her and helping to defend a fort, Dart discovers he can channel the power of a dragon, something that proves incredibly important as the world is threatened by a god of destruction. The Legend of Dragoon was a turn-based RPG where its unique combat mechanic was additions, special timed attacks that could be chained into combos for huge damage. Plus, many party members gained powerful Dragoon forms, where they channel the power of a dragon for more powerful attacks and access to that dragon's magical element. Dart shows up in Astro Bot as the Dragon Knight. His name and description are direct references to his status as a Dragoon. Specifically, he gains the ability to channel the red-eyed dragon using the red-eyed gem, which is what the description is referring to. His gacha item is his broadsword, the initial weapon Dart wields in the original game. Its description refers to the fact that a duplicate of this sword can be found in the Helena prison, where you rescue Dart's friend Shana early on, although the sword is obtained later. In the crash site, Dart stands ready with his sword, a reference to his battle stance. When hit, he will flinch and numbers will pop out of him, a direct reference to when he gets hit in battles in the original game. The Legend of Dragoon has become a cult classic, especially in the West. While it never achieved the success of some of its contemporaries, it manages to build a decent fanbase that persists to this day. However, this is just a standalone game and it never spawned a wider series or anything like that. However, The Legend of Dragoon is available on PS5. After the success of Parappa on the PS1, Mercedes-Benz contacted Sony looking to promote their new car. Masaya Matsuura jumped on board, seeing it as an opportunity to apply his new concept of a game with music-generated stages. The original concept saw players driving through these levels as a living car. However, development of the new Mercedes fell through, and the idea was scrapped. Matsuura still wanted to make a game with the concept, so development shifted to an original title. The project was emboldened when a programmer figured out how to make the PlayStation analyze music CDs, allowing it to generate visuals on the fly. With this in mind, Matsuura switched to wireframe visuals to keep the game's size so small that it could be run entirely off the system's RAM, and the car was replaced by a rabbit. The result was Vib-Ribbon, one of the weirdest yet most technically impressive games released for the PS1. You played as Vibri, a cute little rabbit made of vector graphics, as she went for a stroll along a line. But depending on what music was playing, 4 types of obstacle would appear, requiring players to press the corresponding buttons at the right time. Sometimes these obstacles would be combined, requiring players to press 2 buttons at once. Messing up too many times caused Vibri to devolve into a frog and then a worm, but lots of successful clears would turn her into a magical girl. Good for her. And yes, that music CD aspect was a big part of Vib-Ribbon's appeal. Once the game was loaded, players could swap in a music CD of their choice, and the game would generate levels based on how it analysed the waveforms. Vibri shows up in Astro Bot as the Ribbon Rider. Her gacha item is the Data Circles, a game-changing relic. This item and description are obvious references to the game's music CD generation, as the circles are CDs, and the game literally changed when you swapped between artists. In the crash site, Vibri can be seen marching along a recreation of a Vib-Ribbon level. Hitting her will cause her to perform one of 3 actions, all based on the original game. The 2 flips are based on her movements when pressing R1 or X, while the long leg split is what she does when you press down on the D-pad. The 4th action is not shown as this was a vault move, although they could have easily shown her jumping. Vib-Ribbon was a quirky cult classic that didn't achieve a lot of commercial success, but attracted a lot of oohs and ahs from people fascinated by its ability to operate while also running an audio CD. It's also a favourite of former PlayStation exec Sean Layden, who infamously asked an American audience if they remembered it, despite the game only launching in Japan and Europe. The game did get a PS3 release off the back of that though, so it worked out in the end. However, this did not carry over to future generations, as Vib-Ribbon is not available on the PS5. Whenever he would get stressed at work, Kaz Ayabe would often reminisce about the long summers of his childhood, hanging out in nature where it was quiet and relaxing, a feeling he only ever got as an adult when camping during a rave. He knew he had to replicate the experience somehow, and so he formed the video game company Millennium Kitchen to realise his idea. The idea was pitched to Sony, who took it on after realising it was the third idea of its kind to be pitched to them, so there was likely an audience. Ayabe also pitched the game to illustrator Mineko Ueda on the same day, who thankfully agreed to join the project, as Ayabe had already told Sony that she was involved. And so, Ayabe's dream of turning his summer vacation into a video game became a reality. That game was Boku no Natsuyasumi, literally translated as My Summer Vacation. You play as Boku, which is a name that literally means me. He has been sent to live with his aunt and uncle in the countryside during summer. The game takes place across the entire month of August, where Boku can freely explore the area around the house and see what he can get up to. You are free to get involved with anything you choose. You can fish, you can interact with neighbours, you can fly a kite, or you can choose to do nothing. Ultimately, the game is open-ended, as you choose how you wish to spend your summer holidays, although your time is limited, as after 31 days, it's all over. Boku shows up in Astro Bot as the young holidaymaker, whose description references the game's setting of the 1970s. He takes on his appearance from the original PS1 game. His gacha item and general animations are based around another activity you can choose to take part in: bug catching. In Boku no Natsuyasumi, you can acquire a net, and using this you can catch the various butterflies and beetles roaming around the countryside. You can then keep and catalogue these bugs in cages in your bedroom, and bring them out to do bug fights with local children. Boku in Astro Bot has a net and some bug cages as he proudly shows off his catches. Hitting Boku will release the bugs, but they will ultimately land on his face, allowing him to gently place them back into storage. Boku no Natsuyasumi is one of the earliest examples of the cozy game genre, sitting neatly between the original Harvest Moon, which released 4 years before, and Animal Crossing, which released a year later. It would gain multiple sequels over the years, although the series would not officially leave Japan. However, there is a community of Western fans often enjoying the game through fan translations and emulation. While the series hasn't had a formal entry since 2009, Ayabe and Millennium Kitchen are still around producing spiritual successors, including Natsumon. Boku no Natsuyasumi is not available on PS5. And that is all for the original PlayStation. That was a lot, but this was the longest video of the series. The remaining generations are all a little bit shorter than this, thankfully. I hope you enjoyed this video, and let me know in the comments what some of your favourite cameos are, and if this video has introduced you to any new games you'd never been aware of before. Beyond that, like and subscribe, and I'll see you again soon with the PS2.